there is a meme that I think is inaccurate and unhelpful that China can copy but not innovate. And both historically, China has been responsible for like a huge amount of scientific innovation. And also like the number of papers coming out of China on AI has increased significantly as more than any other country. I mean, there are loads of examples of very, very impressive, innovative scientific achievement coming out of China. Jeff has a take that today China is actually, in a proportional sense, better at innovation and worse at diffusion. And that one big strength that the United States has from a competitive angle is that it's actually much better at diffusion. And I think that will strike a lot of people as being the inverse of what they think based on having read some like stories about high-speed rail and solar cell production and so on, that they have this meme of like China can copy these things and sort of suffuse it like across the country and reduce the cost of production, but it isn't able to create things. And so I think that that's an area where like that stereotype, I can see where it came from based on the specific economic investments that China made in the 90s and 2000s, but I think it is inaccurate and people sort of risk misunderstanding how things are if they buy into that.
Hey listeners, Rob here, Head of Research at 80,000 Hours. I often tell people that we tend not to interview folks who are working in policy roles because even if they know interesting things, they usually can't tell them to you. But we are very lucky to have caught Tantum Collins during a brief window in between two stints at the White House, working on security issues and emerging technology, in this case, frontier AI models. Teddy is one of those people who keeps a fairly low profile, but is super respected by people in the know, as well as just being the kind of guy you would love to grab a beer with. He has accumulated a lot of hard-won knowledge, I would say, from personal experience both at the White House and at DeepMind, a substantial fraction of which he was happy to share in this interview. Teddy and I talk about how AI could strengthen government capacity and how that is a funny double-edged sword, how new technologies force us to confront trade-offs in political philosophy that we were previously able to pretend weren't actually there, to what extent policymakers take different kinds of threats from AI seriously, whether the US and China are in an arms race around AI or not, whether it's okay to transform the world without very much of the world agreeing to it in the first place, the tyranny of small differences when it comes to AI policy, disagreements between different schools of thought around AI policy and proposals that could perhaps unite them all, how the US AI Bill of Rights could be improved, whether AI will transform the labor market and whether it will become a partisan political issue, the tensions between SF culture and DC culture and how to bridge the divide between them, what listeners might be able to do to help with this whole mess, and finally, Panpsychism. Before that, I just want to flag a pretty notable slate of job openings that are likely to be of particular interest to big fans of the show, and indeed specifically to big fans of this episode. Those are the 16 new roles at Open Philanthropy's Global Catastrophic Risk Team across different cause areas like AI governance, AI technical safety, biosecurity and pandemic preparedness, global catastrophic risk capacity building, and finally, a global catastrophic risk cause prioritization. For those who don't know, Open Philanthropy is a large charitable foundation, and much of their work focuses on exactly the problems we discuss the most on this show. I should definitely add a conflict of interest disclaimer that Open Philanthropy is one of 80,000 Hours' biggest donors, so take that for what it's worth. But some recent guests who work or worked there include Holden Karnofsky, Joe Carlsmith, Ajay Kotra, and Tom Davidson. So if you're a regular listener, you probably have some sense of what Open Philanthropy is about, even if you didn't realize it. I'll say more about those 16 roles at the end of the episode. But if you'd like to just go and look directly, head to openphilanthropy.org and click We're Hiring at the top right side of the page. All right, without further ado, I bring you Teddy Collins. Today, I'm speaking with Tantum Collins. Teddy, as he's often called, was Assistant Director for Technology Strategy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy back in 2021 and 2022. Before that, he was a research lead of the Meta research team at DeepMind and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology in DC. He received a BA in Global Affairs from Yale and, as a Marshall Scholar, earned a Master's in International Relations at Cambridge and studied Philosophy of Science at LSE, a true Renaissance man. In 2014, together with General Stanley McChrystal, he co-authored the best-selling book Team of Teams. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Teddy.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope to talk about how AI is currently seen among policymakers and to what extent the US is in a race with China over AI advances. But first, we're in London at the moment, where you've been living recently, but I understand you're just about to head back to DC to start work in the White House yet again. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I'm heading back in just a few weeks. I will be returning for another AI-focused policy role. But today I'm speaking 100% as a private citizen. None of this is reflective of a US government position, and I have not yet begun the role. Obligatory disclaimer.
Yeah. So you left in 2022, right?
Yeah, about 6 months ago. And so it will end up having only been a short stint outside of government, yes.
And I think you weren't quite intending to come back quite so quickly, but people have persuaded you to return.
Yes.
Is this sort of an Avengers situation? Or they need to bring the team back together for one last policy formation?
Exactly, yeah. One last job. If you imagine like the nerdiest possible version of that, then something along those lines. But I have not yet been shown to a flying aircraft carrier, so we'll see.
There's still time. What work is this trip to the White House interrupting? What were you doing up to now?
Yeah, so an area that I'm really interested in and where I've been sort of focusing my efforts for the past 6 months and that I was planning on working on in an academic capacity for the coming year, so I tentatively accepted an academic fellowship, is essentially looking at the effect that a number of technologies, including machine learning, can have on the way that governments function. And in particular, are there ways that machine learning can increase our ability to realize the goals of democracy? At the highest level, this is a problem that I think is quite comparable to AI safety considerations, actually, which is in AI, people are quite worried about the sort of greater AI capabilities, the more important it is to have effective alignment. And I think we see a similar situation in government where there is a balance between, on the one hand, expanding state capacity, and on the other hand, aligning the actions of the state with sort of the democratic consensus or, sort of popular sovereignty, whatever you want to call it. I think there are a lot of ways that AI, among other technologies, could significantly strengthen state capacity. That could be great. It could also be awful and open the door to autocracy if we don't figure out ways to increase the degree to which that is sort of aligned with the popular will. And so I'm interested in a series of questions that are sort of at the intersection of technical and political philosophical considerations there.
Okay, let's see if I've understood that. So you're drawing an analogy between, so one concern that we might have about very advanced AI is that it's going to be incredibly capable. And given that it will have enormous capabilities, it will be extremely important that those capabilities be turned towards goals that we think are desirable. And you're saying, similarly, AI advances could increase the capabilities of the state, increase what governments are capable of doing, which could be good, but it also could be bad if the goals that the government is then pursuing for whatever reasons are not conducive to well-being or whatever outcomes we desire.
Yeah, exactly. So like one way of thinking about this, you could have a heuristic, like how many decisions is the government making versus how rich is the information flow, the sort of binding oversight flow from the general public to those decisions. And already over time, we've seen that government capacity has increased significantly. This is, in most cases, a really, really good thing. But it is also, to some extent, sort of decreased this ratio of how much guidance are people still provide today, roughly the same amount of guidance that they did decades and in some cases even centuries ago, right? We vote at the same frequency. Ballots from an information theoretic perspective are incredibly compressed. That kind of makes sense if you're making decisions for a local community and things move slowly. Now that we have these governments that the sort of government remit has expanded significantly, but the sort of bandwidth of information flow through which the general public guides that has remained more or less the same, with some exceptions. AI could take that remit much, much, much further and significantly expand the set of things that government could do. And I think that there are many ways that AI could also, in parallel, enrich the ability of citizens to guide those actions. But unless we pursue that in a proactive way, I worry that we'll sort of end up in a situation where things get really out of balance.
Right. So I guess studying history, you realize that governments in the past, in the 18th century and earlier, were just extraordinarily incapable by the standards of the modern world, that they had no idea what was going on through most of the country. Like
exactly.
Sometimes they would kind of know how many people were in the capital city or something like that. But after, beyond that range, it was kind of delegated and things that we now think of as central government functions, related to education or healthcare or the welfare state, say,
exactly.
Those weren't on the table for the state to do because it was just inconceivable that they would actually be able to deliver such services.
Yes.
And I guess you're saying there could be a similar massive step up in what the state in principle would be capable of doing due to artificial intelligence. I guess just increasing the amount of monitoring and observation and data processing that's possible.
Exactly. All of those things, being able to make better predictions, possibly being able to better control sort of complex distributed systems that have previously fallen outside of the government remit. There are all kinds of ways that this could expand. And also, the stuff that I think is the most interesting are ways that AI could strengthen things on the other side of this equation, which is to say, like, how can we provide richer, more regular information about people's sort of all things considered political preferences. But I think that is something that, like, even in the best case, creates all kind of thorny philosophical questions. And B, it's by no means guaranteed that those capabilities will emerge. And so I think it sort of like merits proactive research investment.
I guess the main thing I wanted to talk about today was the standard risk that people talk about from artificial intelligence. I guess in particular focusing on the worst case scenarios. I guess to help frame many of the things that you might end up saying over the next couple of hours, I'm curious to know what, maybe setting aside extinction for a minute, what possible negatives outcomes from advances in AI most worry you? Which ones do you think about the most?
The one that is top of mind, and I should give the disclaimer that as anyone who's worked in this space will know, of course, it's one thing in principle to say we're trying to rank concerns by sort of expected impact, and another thing in practice to put numbers on those things. And so I wouldn't like die on the hill of this is going to be in expectation the most harmful thing short of X risk that we will face. But one thing that I do care about a lot is essentially a variant of what we were just talking about, which is to say the risks of autocratic lock-in. And a prompt that I think about a lot that sometimes helps frame this is, if you and I and 100 other people were on the first ship that was going to go settle Mars, and we were going to build a human civilization, and we have to decide, what does that government look like? And we have all of the technology available today. How do we think about choosing a subset of that design space? And that space is huge, and it includes absolutely awful things and mixed bag things, and maybe some things that almost everyone would agree are really wonderful, or at least an improvement on the way that things work today. But that raises all kinds of tricky questions. And my concern is that if we don't approach these kinds of... Now, that's obviously a thought experiment that's removed from the real world. Here, things are messier. But my concern is that if we don't approach sort of the evolution of collective decision-making and government in a deliberate way, we may end up inadvertently backing ourselves into a corner where we have ended up on some slippery slope, and all of a sudden we have, let's say, autocracies on the global stage are strengthened relative to democracies.
Yeah, I guess it's very natural to worry that countries that are already autocratic would use these tools to engage in a level of monitoring of individuals that currently would be impractical. So you could just constantly be checking all of the messages that people are sending and receiving, or like using the fact that we have microphones in almost every room to have these automated systems detecting whether people are doing anything that is contrary to the wishes of the government. And that could just create a much greater degree of lock-in even than there is now. Are you also worried about these kind of technologies being abused in countries like the United States or the UK in the medium term?
I'm certainly not worried in the medium term about existing democracies like let's say the US and the UK becoming something that we would describe as autocratic. Perhaps like another way of reframing it would be, I worry that we've already left opportunities on the table, and that the number of opportunities we will end up leaving on the table could grow, both to make government more effective in a sort of ideology agnostic sense, right, doing things on time and in ways that are affordable and so on. And secondly, missing opportunities to make these institutions more democratic, which is to say to bind them to like reflective popular will. And that we can look at even contemporary democracies, as we were talking about before, sort of the bit rate of preference communication has remained more or less the same for a long time, while, as you noted, government capacity has expanded significantly. In that sense, we've sort of already lost some level of democratic oversight. And this is something that, no, I'm not worried about these countries becoming the PRC, but I do think that there's lots of stuff that we could do to improve sort of the degree to which we instantiate the principles of democracy.
Yeah. Okay, let's now get a bit of an update on, I guess, the state of play as it exists now in terms of what people involved in policymaking in the US and UK, and I guess to some extent the EU as well, what people are thinking about AI, I guess, with a focus kind of on extinction risk and worst case scenarios, rather than maybe regulation of consumer products as they exist right now. I guess the high level thing that I'm really curious to know is, because of who I am, because of the level of interest that I have in existential risk and extinction risk specifically, I just constantly see stuff about that all the time, and I hear from people who are worried about that. But that means that I have an extremely non-representative sample of people talking to me and content being sent to me. So I find it very hard to tell. If I were to step outside that bubble, what do people who are involved in government in various different capacities, from politicians to bureaucrats to people in think tanks and so on in the US and UK, what do they make of this whole set of concerns that have become much more prominent in this year? Did you have your finger on the pulse of any of these groups at all?
Well, government is always very big and distributed, so I wouldn't say this is like an authoritative recounting, but I'm happy to give sort of my take from the sliver of things that I've seen.
Yeah.
Obviously, the institution I'm most familiar with is the US government. I think that to some extent this can generalize especially for other closely allied governments, so let's say Five Eyes and G7 and so on. It is certainly the case that the amount of attention dedicated towards AI in government has increased significantly over the past couple of years, and that includes the amount of attention sort of even just proportionally, that there has been an increase in the consideration given to risks. That includes things that people would categorize as X risk, as well as all kinds of regular, active, ongoing harms, algorithmic discrimination, interpretability issues, and so on. So all of this is getting more attention. I think in particular, some of the things that people who are worried about X risk tend to focus on actually fit into pre-existing national security priorities pretty well. So, for instance, if we think about cyber-related X risk having to do with AI or AI-related bio-risk, these are categories of harms that, although previously not mainly through the lens of AI-related stuff, there are plenty of institutions and people in the US government and in other governments that have been worried about those types of risks for a long time. And I think it's safe to say that almost everyone, for almost all of these, in almost all these domains, AI risk is now top of mind. That doesn't mean that if you go into the White House, you will see people doing sort of open fill style, very rigorous rankings based on importance and neglectedness and tractability and so on. And it doesn't mean that the people whose work ends up reducing these risks would even articulate it in the way that someone in, let's say, the EA community would. But I do think that increasingly a lot of this work in government sort of dovetails with those priorities. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I think it's also quite sensible that this is maybe the extinction risk or the like catastrophic risk that governments are turning their attention to first, because it seems like the potential misuse of large language models or other AI models to help with bioterrorism or to development of bioweapons or to engage in cyber attacks, that seems like it's something that could be serious in the next few years. I guess we don't know how serious it will be. We don't know how many people will actually try, but it does seem like an imminent threat. And so people should be thinking about what can we do now?
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm happy to say that there are absolutely like smart, capable people working in government who are worried about those things. So if that helps you and the listeners sleep easily at night.
Well, I'm sure they've got it covered. I guess my perception is that if you'd gone into the White House 2 years ago and said that alignment problems with artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence systems could develop their own agency and their own goals that would be in conflict with humanity, and they might want to disempower humanity in order to be able to achieve their goals, people would have, maybe they would have laughed, maybe they wouldn't, but they would have thought that this was a very quirky concern and not something that really needed to be addressed by the national security community. What would the reaction be if you raised that today?
I think that from a sort of optics and presentation standpoint, well, maybe stepping back, overall, clearly, we've seen a shift in the Overton window, and there are all kinds of things that seemed outlandish and sort of sci-fi tinfoil hat concerns a couple of years ago that are now increasingly mainstream. I still think it's the case that in most government settings, if someone begins using language that, I mean, so much of this is just semantics, but if someone frames these things in ways that echo these like sci-fi tropes, they will probably be taken on the margin less seriously than if they ground it in the specific types of concerns that governments have taken seriously for a long time. So, for instance, and this is totally hypothetical, like, could a US adversary or a terrorist group harness specific capabilities to generate specific harms that could kill a huge number of people? Obviously, post-COVID, there is sort of increased awareness of pandemic potentials, right? So like that's something that is top of mind for people. Anything that fits into sort of the types of weaponization concerns that people have had in many cases for decades. So you think about like biological and chemical warfare agents and stuff like that. That's something that like the US national security community has had a long-standing interest in trying to track, what foreign entities like have the capacity to produce that kind of stuff and the interest in doing so. Obviously, post 9/11, with the war on terror, the US invested hugely in this apparatus for tracking not just nation-state actors, but non-nation state groups. And so some of that lines quite nicely. It's probably still a case that the best framing to get attention is not going to be the language that is used in other communities, including, let's say, like the EA and AI communities, broadly speaking. But yeah, that set of concerns, if you frame it the right way, I think that now people will listen to it.
Yeah. So it sounds like misuse is squarely inside the Overton window now, whereas misalignment or AI going rogue is people are open to it, but it's not something that people are necessarily thinking of them that they need to work on it sometime soon. Is that kind of right? Is there any kind of way of framing the misalignment thing that makes it more acceptable and feel more normal to people? Because in some ways, I think it is just an extension of things that we're extremely familiar with.
Definitely.
In some ways, like I think people often over-egg how weird it is in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So like at one level, there is like principal agent problems, which are almost a perennial challenge of like democracies and interstate relations. At the other end, you have the paperclipper, where I think if you said that to a policymaker who wasn't really deeply enmeshed in this community, and you tried to explain things by way of this thing that's going to kill everyone in order to produce paperclips, they would probably like not take you very seriously. But as you noted, like in the structure of the concern is something that people have encountered loads of times. And to tie it back sort of tangentially to the things we were talking about before, there are all kinds of ways in which concerns about institutional function mirror these things. So principal agent problem, I mean, lots of people have discussed sort of like the firm and capitalist incentives writ large as having these similar problems, you know, resulting from optimizing for a metric that doesn't fully instantiate all of the things that we actually care about. So like in some very abstract way, it's something that people are quite familiar with. I'll also say there are absolutely people who are concerned about alignment problems. And I would say there is a very large number of people who are concerned about specific problems that have already been instantiated or that are very, very plausible. So for instance, you have trained something and you didn't want it to be racist and it ended up being racist. Or the ways that, for instance, you know, ChatGPT and other LLMs can not do exactly what you want them to do. So I think that the number of people who are sympathetic to those types of risks is many times larger than the subset of people who would be able to say in a sentence, alignment risk is a serious AI concern in a general way, and we should prioritize it. So there's a lot of gray area there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've been thinking this year about all kinds of different analogies you can have for misuse and misalignment, like other things that we can compare it to. One that's been salient to me recently is the comparison with a coup. So like, why is it that an AI system might want to disempower another group? It's kind of similar to the reasons why a military group that has all the weapons and can take over an organization relatively straightforwardly, if it has goals that are not the same as the people who currently run that organization, then they might decide to just walk in with guns pointed at them and take the thing over wholesale. That doesn't seem weird to us. We're familiar with how humans would do that when they have different goals than the people who are currently leading a broad apparatus. We can kind of imagine that the same thing might happen if there were, like, imagine for the hypothetical, that there were an AI system that were as capable of taking over the government as the entire military would if it was completely united with that goal. Yeah. So it was really, in some ways, quite straightforward because they basically have the overwhelming amount of ability to do violence. Then it is kind of obvious why someone might opt to do that if they didn't have some very strong value that told them that it was an extremely wrong thing to do. Yeah, does that analogy stand out in your mind? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, Goodhart's law shows up in sort of all principal agent challenges. And at the macro level, we could think of a coup. At the micro level, we can think of like the manager-managee relationship, which is to say you give some incentives to say, write as many reports as you can, right? Or like achieve these performance goals. And almost inevitably, that is, in optimizing for something that's parsimonious, we end up choosing something that is not complete as a characterization of the objectives that we actually want this person or this team or this entity or this organization to achieve. And this shows up in government all the time because governments are absolutely massive. And it shows up also not just within government, but in terms of governments attempting to set incentives for external actors like corporations and individuals and so on. In many ways, the sort of whole regime of incentives created by legal systems to try to get individuals to behave in certain ways is a case study in this. And sometimes it works okay, and sometimes it backfires catastrophically. And this is a bit of a tangent, but for a while when I was in school, I did some intensive language study, and there is this cliche that, you know, language is essential as a window onto culture and so on. And this is true, of course, not just like between actually different languages, but between sort of different professional vernaculars and so on. And like the way that people speak about something in SF and the way that they speak about it in DC will often be really, really, really different. And one thing that I'm very glad to see has changed in recent years, and that was much more worried about, let's say, 5 years ago, was that there were just very, very few people who could take something that had been formulated in, let's say, SF speak and articulate it in a way that would be digestible to someone who is a native DC speaker. And so the kinds of stuff that you're mentioning are exactly correct. And I think that there are many, many, many of those parallels. And in some ways, that's sort of what has motivated my interest in this question of like the design of governance institutions, because I think there are like underexplored parallels there. But I won't sort of torpedo this too much by getting back into that.
Yeah. It's hard to track all of the news related to this topic at the moment. But two things that have stood out to me recently are that the UK is planning to. I guess in London, I hear more about UK government things organically. So the UK is planning to have this AI safety summit. I think in November, where I think extinction and other risks are going to be on the table. And they also earmarked £100 million in funding for some sort of AI safety research. Although I think it was a little bit hard to find out exactly what the details were. It sounds like you're aware of both of these things. Do you have any opinions, or do you have any idea of what the specifics are?
I definitely don't know anything about the specifics beyond sort of what's been mentioned publicly. My general position is sort of, I guess, the week prior would be, I think all of these are directionally good. I think that increasing sort of mainstreaming concerns about safety and also about a whole other set of sort of AI ethics issues, the kinds of things that were, for instance, like brought up in the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. I think that those are unequivocally good actions. In terms of the actual efficacy of a given program, because AI is so general purpose and research is so unpredictable and different institutions conduct it in very different ways, it's so execution dependent. So I think it's very, very hard to say. I mean, £100 million sounds like a lot of money. There's lots of good stuff that could do. It's also possible that very smart people will allocate it in ways that made sense a priori as a research bet and end up not paying off. We'll wait to see like what the actual impact is. But I would say that sort of from an optics perspective, it is certainly good as a reflection of the fact that government is taking these things more seriously. And hopefully that also reflects the fact that the general public is taking these things more seriously.
Yeah. Something that occurred to me in the shower last night, it was thinking about this program. So if you're a small country or a relatively small country, say Sweden or something, and in general the government there is worried about what effect AI might have on the world, Sweden has relatively little regulatory power to shape what OpenAI does. But Sweden could fund, for a tiny fraction of the government budget, a whole lot of research into ways to direct AI more safely, trying to detect, ways that things might go wrong and heading them off early. Sweden, if it's willing to fund people in other countries, if it's willing to fund people actually doing the work overseas, is in as good a position roughly to do that as almost any other group. So I guess it will be interesting to see whether any other countries kind of get in on this activity.
Absolutely, and I think another thing that remains very sort of underdetermined at present is what types of roles will countries that are not currently major AI hubs adopt. I think that a possible failure mode, which happens a lot in lots of areas of like national policymaking, is that everyone wants to sort of have it all. But the clustering effects are such that, especially in something that requires as much collaboration as AI, realistically, it would be very, very difficult for like a Sweden to build a world-class competitive AI ecosystem in Stockholm. Whereas, as you say, they absolutely could decide to funnel their money to a specific subset of research if they're open to funding foreign researchers or being part of some collaboration, right? Let's say some like EU-wide thing. Then there are lots of possibilities there. There was this phase in 2017 to 2019 where seemingly every government released some like national AI strategy, which varied hugely in terms of the amount of resourcing that came with them, the amount of specificity, and almost always involved sort of echoing the same very, very hand-wavy principles. I think that now we're seeing this phase where the rubber is hitting the road and governments are making real decisions about how to resource things. And just from the outside, it's a fascinating question for any of these countries, because in almost none of them has the government itself played a major role in AI research recently. And so they all have this question of like, what tools can they use to, via indirect means, influence the direction that things go in? And especially for entities that are, let's say, fairly wealthy, but wouldn't be considered top 5 AI players. How do they decide to do that? It would be interesting to see.
Yeah. I think, was it 6 months ago or something? It seemed like the UK government was really interested in this, creating a British version of ChatGPT. And I think
yes,
I saw
that's right. Was it BritGPT? Yeah. I remember something.
I don't think they called it BritGPT.
But that was what the press called it.
Some people making fun of it on that basis. I haven't heard as much about that recently, so I wonder whether.
I mean, soft power. That's one big thing the UK is going for it, right? I'm sure they could produce a more charming version.
I think I saw a satire where basically the point of BritGPT was to have GPT but with British spelling. 100 million pounds well spent. Because while we're on recent announcements, a few days ago, OpenAI said that they would spend 20% of their compute budget, if I remember. It wasn't just alignment research; it was alignment research related to super intelligent systems specifically. It sounded like they thought, well, we have some decent leads on how to align systems that ChatGPT as it exists right now.
Yeah.
But if you had something that was just like substantially more had broader capabilities than any human by far and was just much better at lots of different things than us, then it seems like it's going to get substantially more challenging, and they feel like they're a bit out of their depth right now. It sounded that they were happy to concede that, and so they wanted to put a lot of resources into that before having those systems, which I think is a smart move. Did you have any reaction to that announcement?
So my reaction, I think, would be similar to the sort of UK funding allocation decision, with maybe similar but slightly different caveats. So at the high level, I think it is a very good sign that major labs take these risks seriously, seem to be fairly honest about the stuff that they can and cannot do, and are willing to back that up from a resourcing perspective. Maybe the caveats I'll throw in are, A, it's very, very hard to say in an ideal world how much of an OpenAI budget should be dedicated to what types of risks. So it's entirely possible that maybe an outside audit would conclude that, in fact, they should put more of it towards near-term risks versus super intelligent risks and so on, right? So I have no really strong views on that. But broadly speaking, I think directionally, it's very good to reserve resourcing for safety and ethics work. The other thing I'll say, of course, is that obviously there are many circumstances where the market creates adverse incentives and where companies feel some tension between sort of their PR priorities and their profit incentives. And in many historical instances, this has resulted in companies making pledges that seem great, and then when you dig into them and see how they unfold, actually, it's sort of much more complicated. I have no reason to think that's the case here. I happen to also know Jan quite well, who leads safety at OpenAI. I think he's fantastic. I think he does excellent work. Everything I've seen from OpenAI suggests that these concerns are genuine. But of course, it's worth flagging that, as with the sort of government allocation of money, the proof is in the pudding at some level.
Yeah. It's pure Marxism. I tell you, I can't believe it. You've really gone off the deep end on the on the left there. No, I think my concern with the government funding, I suppose, is that it could be that because the government is relatively far away from it doesn't necessarily have the AI expertise, that they might end up funding stuff that's really quite daft from a scientific point of view. And then I suppose with OpenAI, you might worry that it's going to get diverted into things that are more commercial, that are more profit motivated one way or another, or at least that might only make sense from a view that's somewhat biased towards maybe the activities that OpenAI is engaged in one way or another.
Exactly. That would be, I'd say, sort of the template of concern that I would bring to any private sector commitments like this. That's not to say that they're not good. The commitment is better than the absence of a commitment, if you're going to choose one. And so I think that this is all very good. I'm just putting in the footnote the fact that
the devil will be in the details.
Exactly. The devil will be in the details.
Yeah. A topic that's got a lot of airplay this year, of course, is China and AI. And there's a couple of different angles there. I guess, one is the arms race idea that maybe the US should just, even if it's very nervous about all of this, it should go full steam ahead with AI capabilities, because otherwise they'll lose their lead to China, and that would be so bad. A second fear is the kind of one that you raised earlier about how China might use AI to monitor its population and control Chinese people in a way that would find repugnant. And I guess a third one is how China might use AI in military applications to gain a strategic advantage. Okay, so those are the three big categories that I've heard. I'm curious to hear potentially about what you might have to say about all of those. But the first one in particular, because I understand this is something that you've spent a bit of time looking into over the years. I think you were looking into China-related things specifically as part of your non-resident fellowship at CSET, is that right?
Yeah, so I did actually sort of in all three of my, I guess, AI-related positions, which is to say when I was at DeepMind, when I was at CSET, or as a non-resident fellow at CSET, and also in government, parts of all of those roles involved researching Chinese capabilities and sort of intentions and legislation and so on related to AI.
Yeah, I guess to put the question simply, would you say the US is in an arms race with China over AI?
So I hate to sound like an academic, which for the record I'm not, but to some extent this does boil down to a sort of semantic distinction. So there are some ways in which it resembles an arms race and some ways in which it doesn't. The ways in which it does are the obvious ones, which is to say the US and China, by most metrics, are by a significant margin the sort of leading producers of AI-related research and products in the world. And in both places, AI capabilities are advancing quite rapidly. And in both places, there is some level of rhetoric around how do relative capabilities stack up, and we shouldn't slow down because if we slow down, then we'll lose to the adversary. There are also a number of ways in which it does not resemble a sort of traditional arms race dynamic. The first is that because very little of this is being done by governments, it's mostly being done by private labs and to some extent universities. It's quite distributed. It's more open than typical arms race sort of development is. And most Western labs are more concerned on average about competition with other Western labs than they are with competition about Chinese labs.
Yeah.
Obviously, that could change, but there's relatively little coordination between these labs. And at the moment, there's relatively little coordination between labs and government. Obviously, that is at some level increasing. But I would say the ecosystem is much more distributed than what we typically think of as an arms race setup. Another thing that's worth noting is that the US and China remain, by a significant margin, each other's leading collaborators on AI research. And the sort of...
That's true even now.
Yeah.
Huh.
And in fact, US-China AI collaborations are maybe predictably, like by far the sort of the dyad that produces the most AI research. And not only that, but the US-China AI collaborations have increased proportionally since 2010, more than almost any other sort of pairing. In part, that's just because both have taken AI very, very seriously, and China in particular during that period has advanced quite rapidly from a sort of a STEM perspective. But all of that is quite telling. And I think to some people, especially in the national security community, obviously some people have concerns about proliferation of knowledge and so on. In other ways, it's like very hopeful because it suggests that maybe there is a foundation for instance, collaboration on safety stuff, setting standards, and so on. So that would be sort of my on the one hand, on the other characterization here.
Yeah. I guess one argument that I've heard for why, of course, there is a bit of a structure of a race here, but you might say it's not a very hot race right now. A bunch of arguments that I've heard are basically just that the US, in terms of capabilities, is a decent number of years ahead, that China is probably going to fall behind just because, well, I suppose two reasons. One is they're finding it more difficult to get cutting-edge chips, so they might fall behind in terms of the availability of compute. And perhaps also they just don't have access to the same level of human capital as some of the best labs in the West have now. And maybe also that China has this year been announcing or contemplating quite serious regulation of AI domestically, such that, again, we wouldn't expect China to realistically, catch up or overtake the US anytime soon. It's kind of maybe accepting with those regulations that is going to remain in second place, and it's comfortable with that. So the race isn't very intense, at least. Right. Well, yeah. What do you think of those arguments?
I guess I'm more sympathetic to some of those than others. In general, I would say I'm wary of depictions that the US is far ahead in AI because A, things are so unpredictable, and B, the AI landscape is so broad and varied. To give a couple of sort of concrete things to back that up, from a research volume perspective, Chinese AI output has been greater than US AI output for several years in terms of like total number of papers and patents and so on. And I should say, by the way, there's a lot of great research on this. And in particular, I would recommend Jeff Ding's work, also a former ADK interviewee, I believe, and Jordan Schneider, who does a lot of China analysis and recently has focused increasingly on AI. And I think both of them produce like really good stuff. Also, CSET has a lot of good, very sort of data-informed takes on how to size up something as sort of broad as like the research output of two countries in an enormous field. But at a high level, the volume of Chinese output is very high. It's bigger than anywhere else. If you include Chinese language research, then I think it's like actually 4 or 5 times the number of papers that get produced in the US. Often people will subset that. Now, the average quality of a Chinese paper as measured by citations is lower than that of a US paper. People often subset things by saying within the top 10%, within the top 5%, within the top 1% of papers as measured by citations, who is producing more of them. China has now surpassed the US in all of those. So it recently surpassed the US in top 1%. Obviously, it's difficult. The macro conditions right now in China are hard. It's possible that this will shift back in the coming years, but that has been the direction of trend so far. There are several subdomains of AI where China is unequivocally more sophisticated. The most obvious of these is computer vision. It is the case that in terms of the sort of currently dominant or most hype-laden paradigm, which is to say LLMs and more broadly big transformer-based architectures, the labs that jumped into the lead initially and retain that lead now are Western labs. But I would say 2 things on that. The first is that, again, largely because of the openness of AI research compared to other domains of like dual use significance, the potential to catch up is significant. There are other factors pulling the other way. You can have sort of, I think there are a lot of questions about like recursive self-improvement at the lab level, but it's certainly feasible to see China catching up leading Chinese labs catching up quite quickly. Also for reasons having to do with sort of like the general composition of Chinese labs versus US labs. When you look at big Chinese AI research institutes, headcount-wise, they tend to be more engineering-heavy relative to scientists than Western labs. The sort of turn that research has taken over the past 3 or 4 years has been a little bit more in the engineering-y direction. It's less about, sort of like creating this, let's say, creating AlphaZero, which involves, if you don't have the 10 best people in the world at the same whiteboard, maybe you never create that. And it's a bit more about these engineering considerations. How can you parallelize one of these sort of huge models across like a large number of chips and so on? And the second thing, I know this is a bit of a ramble, but the second thing I'll say on sort of foundation models in particular is that I think whenever we're in the midst of one of these research paradigms, it's easy to underestimate how quickly the dominant paradigm can shift. And so not only is it totally feasible that Chinese labs could catch up on the sort of LLM and foundation model front, it's also totally feasible that in 2 years' time, the new paradigm will be something totally different and maybe something that plays to Chinese capabilities more.
What about the idea that the US will have an increasing lead in terms of compute availability? Does that seem plausible?
It definitely seems plausible. I think it's too early to say what the long-run effect will be of various measures, including, obviously, there's the CHIPS Act, which is like significant domestic investment on the US side, as well as the export controls that try to limit Chinese access to not just the chips themselves, but also this kind of like stack of material and machines that produce them. So it's certainly possible that will be an inhibition. China has invested a ton in indigenization. I think it is certainly the case. I mean, one area where I personally have updated is a few years ago, I would have thought that lead would be very, very difficult to defend just because in general, Chinese manufacturing capacity is significant. It's sort of an incredibly sophisticated ecosystem. They have the capability to make lots of stuff. The more that I have, I'm not a hardware person by training, the more that I've learned about this space, the more I've appreciated how difficult it is to machine this stuff at the level of precision necessary and the degree to which most of those components come from a small number of countries that are like pretty tightly allied with the US. So it is undoubtedly difficult. China has invested a ton in trying to build out its own production capabilities with only middling results. There's good reason to be skeptical that marginal investment will make a big difference, especially given that sort of the macroeconomic situation in China at the moment is sort of challenging. That said, it's completely possible, A, that they managed to catch up. In some ways, this resembles the LLM thing. A, they could catch up sort of like on our terms, as it were, like by building comparable machines. B, in semiconductor production, as in AI algorithmic development, the paradigms shift relatively frequently, not quite as frequently because hardware just takes sort of like longer to gestate. But it's totally possible that some of these more off-the-wall bets, neuromorphic computing, optical computing, something like that, takes off. And in 5 years' time, we're talking about a totally different supply chain, maybe one that the US does not control, the US and its allies don't control, maybe one that where China has like a significant advantage. And the final thing I'll say is that the main costs that are imposed by not having the sort of latest and greatest chips, it's not so much an absolute threshold on what you can do, and it's more just that sort of the energy expense goes up, and so you're getting sort of fewer flops per watt. And that is something... So you
can just throw more of the ordinary chips at it for longer and spend more money on the electricity.
Exactly. And in fact, there's an interesting precedent here, which is that there was a time, I would need to look up the exact year, but when the US restricted Chinese access to Xeon chips made by Intel to try and inhibit Chinese production of supercomputers. And China responded by saying, fine, we're going to make a supercomputer that's just as good, and we're going to do it with homegrown chips just to prove a point. So obviously, that raises the cost. And on the margin, raising the cost is a good way in expectation of sort of like dissuading an adversary because it makes it harder for them to do it, but it doesn't make it impossible. And
well, the thing is, I mean, the cost of these supercomputers as a fraction of national GDP is just not very high. So if you're willing to spend 10 times as much as you were because this is just the number one thing for you, then maybe it's not a true impediment.
Exactly. So maybe sort of two quick reflections there. The first is that indeed the budgets for AI-related stuff have gone up a ton recently relative to where they were before and have reached a level that is very significant even for large companies. But the spending capabilities of major governments are typically much, much bigger. And so one can imagine a world, I have no idea where we'll end up, but one can imagine a world where the amount of funding that gets poured into building these facilities and or doing the biggest training runs continues to increase quite significantly. I think that there is a sense right now like, oh, these numbers have gotten astronomical, and in a relative sense they have, but that doesn't mean that we're close to the ceiling, depending on like which actors decide to like really jump into it. The second point I'll make, and you know, I'm always wary of, I'm not a historian, I'm always wary of making sort of broad inferences, but there are lots of examples from Chinese history, both modern and prior, of a willingness to throw a huge amount of resourcing at massive projects and an ability to do coordination at a scale that almost any other government would find really, really challenging. So that's just a long way of saying it's certainly not the case that raising the cost makes it impossible.
I guess there's backyard steel smelting. I think
exactly.
Managed to kill a few million people.
Exactly.
In the pursuit of that.
Sometimes with greater economic efficiency than other times, but even more recently, there are a series of sort of science and engineering mega projects that have been remarkably impressive.
Totally. We'll stick up a link to the iron smelting project for people who want to get that historical reference. It didn't work out, but no, yes, that's a cheap shot, because I'm sure more recently they've managed to accomplish some mega projects that are really very impressive. I mean, I guess we absolutely know they have.
Yes, and also, you know, historically, I mean, there are all kinds of just infrastructure projects that at the sort of respective times in history would have been unfathomable to any other civilization, whether that is sort of building a river, building the Great Wall of China, all kinds of just like absolutely massive endeavors, and loads of stuff more recently sort of in the STEM space. Yeah.
What about the other point about China's domestic AI regulation? Do you know very much about what they've decided to do this year?
Yeah, so I have followed this. Again, I don't know. I've been out of government this year, so I know only sort of what's in the public, what's been published publicly. And again, it's always difficult. It's always difficult to predict what the impact of this stuff will be. And in the China case in particular, it's often hard to get a sense of sort of the relative motivations for different stuff. And so, for instance, in the case of LLMs, it seemed clearly to be the case that to some extent, these restrictions are grounded in fears about these systems perhaps spreading messaging that is contrary to the messaging that the CCP would like to see. It seems as though, to some extent, it's also grounded in the kinds of concerns that are shared in the Western world, which is to say, like, these systems could be dangerous, they're somewhat erratic. We should eventually get to a better place than we are now in terms of like having some guarantees that users can rely on about how and when to trust these models to do different things. It's quite early to say. Again, I would say Jeff Ding has done some very cool work, some cool translations of documents in this space. So just a couple of days ago, he released a translation of something that had been put together, I think, by Alibaba Research, together with this basically government think tank that was comparing sort of Chinese approaches to regulation to Western approaches to regulation, and in fact is advocating for something that looks a bit more like the approach that is taken in the US, which they generally describe as being slightly heavier on sort of soft law, which is to say norms that are maybe enforced by third parties and that involve consultation with the companies producing these things and so on, as opposed to what they describe as sort of like a slightly more traditional hard law approach that's been taken in China. But yeah, the short version is China is absolutely doing AI regulation. It's probably too early to say how effective it will be or what they actually want to get out of it. But in broad brushstrokes, my inner optimist wants to say that is maybe a sign that that there is perhaps a foundation for some kind of international coordination, though that's complicated for a whole host of reasons. And B, that at the very least, even if there isn't formal coordination, it's more feasible to avoid race conditions if you have multiple entities that say, we will make the decision to impose some regulation. Again, the devil's in the details. So I don't want to sound too naive, but it could be good news.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wish more listeners knew about AI in China?
There are a whole bunch of things. And in a funny way, I think that a lot of news coverage of China tends to fluctuate between extremes. And this is true in AI as well as sort of like more broadly, where there will be a hype cycle that is, the rise of China is inevitable. And then there will be a hype cycle that says, a centralized system was never going to work. Why did we ever take this? Why did we ever take this threat seriously? And of course, almost always the reality is somewhere in the middle. And I think that when China began making investments in AI, in particular with the sort of 2017 release of this report from the State Council that was AI focused, I think that for a lot of people was the first time that they began paying attention to what might China-related AI things look like. And in some critical ways, China is, of course, different than the US and other Western countries. I think that initially there was a moment of not fully appreciating how different the sort of research culture, and in particular, the relationship between companies and the government is in China relative to Western countries. But now I worry that things have gone too far and that people have sort of these like caricatured versions in their mind of what things look like in China. And so there are many of these, but like to list a few, there is a meme that I think is inaccurate and unhelpful that China can copy but not innovate. And obviously, both historically, China has been responsible for like a huge amount of scientific innovation, and also like again, like the number of papers coming out of China on AI has increased significantly as more than any other country. I mean, there are loads of examples of like very, very impressive, innovative scientific achievement coming out of China, and in particular, to cite Jeff again. He has written an interesting paper that describes the difference between sort of innovation and diffusion of technologies in terms of the effect it has on national power. And so there are some countries that historically played a big role in, for instance, early industrial technology, but didn't manage to diffuse it across the country effectively enough to, for instance, make the most of it from a military perspective or economic growth. And there are others that did the inverse. And so in the 1800s, there was a lot of commentary that the US was terrible at creating things, but was like pretty good at like copying and diffusing. Jeff has a take, he has some interesting ways of measuring this, that today China is actually, in a proportional sense, better at innovation and worse at diffusion. And that one big strength that the United States has from a competitive angle is that it's actually much better at diffusion. And I think that will strike a lot of people as being the inverse of what they think based on having read some like stories about high-speed rail and solar cell production and so on, that they have this meme of like China can copy these things and sort of suffuse it like across the country and reduce the costs of production, but it isn't able to create things. And so I think that that's an area where like that stereotype, I can see where it came from based on the specific economic investments that China made in the 90s and 2000s, but I think it is like inaccurate and people sort of risk misunderstanding like how things look if they buy into that.
Yeah, I think that's tricky about that is if you're behind the technological frontier, then it makes sense to try to copy in order to catch up, regardless of whether you could do your own innovation or not. So because that's just the fastest route to getting there.
Completely. Yeah. And so I think that like there was this period, I mean, China's been this obviously economic growth in China like over the past couple of decades has been quite remarkable. I think people often mistake a decision to do thing A with like the inability to do thing B. And in this case, I think it's exactly what you said.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll also just list one or two other sort of like China misconceptions. Like there are loads out there.
That's
another one is this idea that like all of these companies are completely aligned and they take all of their marching orders from the government. Again, it's easy to see where this came from. Like there is like almost all major companies do have sort of like a party committee within them. There is in many ways a tighter relationship between the tech community and the government, definitely than in the US, where it's sort of that for a whole host of reasons, there's been historical mistrust. But there is still intensely fierce competition between companies, and the society writ large, I think, is like much more pluralistic than it is often depicted as being in the US. And so we'll get these sensationalized stories about, for instance, the social credit system and so on. And it often ends up being grounded in something that isn't, it's not woven out of whole cloth, but it's miscontextualized to like a very worrying degree.
I'll stick up a link to something about the social credit system. As far as I can tell, Western reporting on that has been basically complete bollocks.
Like almost total nonsense.
Completely nonsense, yeah.
And the problem is it just kind of like ties into this theme, which is there are pieces of that are not wrong. Like China does have a huge surveillance state.
Yes,
right. And like one fact that I think people often don't appreciate is that, to like somewhat contradict myself now, one fact that people often don't appreciate is that like the Chinese internal security budget for the past several years has been higher than its defense budget. So, people worry about they compare the Chinese defense budget to like the US defense budget. And it's often easy to lose track of the fact that even more money is being spent on
internal threats,
a lot of domestic stuff, a lot of which is very repressive. So like there's plenty of reason to be concerned, but often the sort of bits and pieces that get pulled out in news coverage are inaccurate. And so the social credit system would be one of those. And I think that leads to a general representation, like a simplified representation of China as this sort of unitary actor. And being an autocracy is not really the same thing. Everyone has principal agent problems, to bring it back to what we were talking about before. And there's plenty of internal competition within the government, between companies, lots of sort of differences in terms of the goals that companies would like to strive for versus what the government wants them to do. One way of interpreting the tech crackdown that Xi Jinping has led is that those incentives clearly were not aligned to the satisfaction of like the CCP, or at least like the Politburo Standing Committee. And so yeah, that would be another misconception. Also, the idea that like there's no AI safety, concern in China. There are people who are worried about this. It's probably like a smaller community than respectively than it is in Western countries. But I think often we end up with this like sort of cartoon impression of the country.
Yeah. Another thought that I've found myself coming back to repeatedly this year in terms of US, China racing over AI is just given that cybersecurity is as bad as it is, it seems trying to win the race by training a model in your country rather than the other country seems incredibly perilous, because it seems very likely that if it's widely known that this model that you've trained is potentially could provide a decisive strategic advantage or has enormous geopolitical implications, then probably it's just going to get nicked by the other country, because just offensive hacking in general dominates defense at the moment. Does that seem like a legitimate worry?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I think this is a huge concern. Sure. I think that in general, yes. I mean, yes.
Okay, right. Okay, cool. All right, good. Because overall, it sounds like you think that there is a decent amount of race dynamic between the US and China, or that at least we can't set that aside completely and say, well, there's no worry here. So this is like a consideration that needs to be weighed against everything else.
Yeah, definitely. In general, there are a host of questions that listeners have probably come across previously, having to do with the tension between the benefits that come from openness and the security risks that brings. One of the things that historically has been really nice about the AI world has been that it has instantiated a lot of values that in general are great around openness and collaboration and open sourcing code, sharing models, publishing results, opening things up to peer feedback, etc.
Yes. I have found it very ironic that the scientific discipline that I am most nervous about, maybe with the exception of gain-of-function research, it seems to be the only one that is extremely healthy in all of these respects.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's very, and part of that, I think there are a whole host of like sort of cultural reasons. There are also, of course, some innate reasons, which is that anything that's digital, the marginal cost of sharing is just much lower than with physical stuff. So now recently, of course, as the sort of cost of training these models has gone up, that's been difficult. But of course, inference cost is still pretty low. So, the other day I was running Whisper. I was running the biggest version of Whisper, and it's just on my MacBook, and it works fine. And of course, now there are a bunch of generative models that you can run locally as well. And so, I think that it helps openness and in some ways harms security that these tools are so easily and readily shared. And that creates lots of tricky questions. And I do not think that there is sort of like a magic bullet here. I think that there are like a lot of difficult decisions that governments and labs will have to make around where on that frontier between sort of openness and security they want to live. This is one of the things that was the most visceral to me when I transitioned from DeepMind to government, is that at DeepMind and in the AI community in general, there is this major emphasis on trying to make sure that your work is shareable and publicly visible, and that comes down to, it's reflected in terms of like office layouts and trying to make it easy for people to collaborate. And it also exists at a more macro level, which is the types of achievement that people care about, getting papers published at conferences. It's like an innately public undertaking. And in government, this is a bit of a cliche, but it's sort of exactly the inverse insofar as the cooler your work is, the less you can tell people about it, right? And so everyone wants to be in like the innermost compartments and go through 10 locked doors in order to get to their office. And this is painting things in broad brushstrokes, but clearly there's kind of like a big cultural difference there. And it will be very interesting to see how the AI community evolves in that respect.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about what we might hope governments will do on AI regulation over the next few years. I guess, trading off, or like dealing with that incredibly difficult trade-off among many other things. Yeah, do you have a view on which regulatory approaches are most promising, all things considered, for governments to try to pursue over the next couple of years?
I think there are a few sort of like level zero foundational things that make sense to do. One is, at the moment, especially in the West, there are major disconnects between just even the way that people in government use language and think about things relative to the way that people in the tech world do. And so one important step zero is just increasing communication between labs and government. And I think recently there's been a lot of like positive movement in that direction. Yeah. A second and related thing, and this somewhat ties back to these sort of democratization questions, is that even under the most competent technocracy, I would be worried about a process that doesn't involve a significant amount of public consultation, given how general purpose these systems are and how pervasive the effects that they could have on our lives will be. And so I think that government has a lot of work to do, both in terms of reaching out to and engaging the AI community, and also in terms of engaging the general public. There's been a lot of cool work in this direction recently. I would highlight what the Collective Intelligence Project has undertaken. They've led a series of what they call alignment assemblies, essentially exercises designed to engage large, ideally representative subsets of the population with questions about what kinds of AI things worry you the most. And also recently from labs, there's been some interest in this stuff. So OpenAI has this sort of democratic input for AI sort of grant that that people have just applied for. And then also there are several labs that are working on projects in the vein of sort of some stuff we were talking about before. How can AI itself be used to, in particular LLMs, how can we use these to sort of facilitate larger scale deliberative processes than before? And one of the projects I worked at when I was at DeepMind, and I'm actually still collaborating with some of my former colleagues at DeepMind on, is something in this direction. So that would be some sort of like very basic before even landing on a policy stuff that I think is important. Beyond that, I think that there are some areas that are relatively uncontroversially good. So to the extent that we think that AI will at some level be a public good and that private market incentives will not sufficiently incentivize the kind of safety and ethics research that we want to happen, I think that like allocating some public funding for that stuff is a good idea. And that's sort of like the full gamut of X-risk alignment things, sort of like more present day prosaic ethics, impact considerations, interpretability research, sort of like the full list. And a final thing that I think is as close to a no-brainer as you can get is that clearly some kind of clearer benchmarking and standards regime is important, because right now it's sort of the Wild West and these things are just out there, and people, not only is it difficult to measure what these things can and cannot do, but there is almost nothing in the way of widely known, trusted intermediary certifications that a non-expert user can engage with to get a feel for how and when they should use a given system. And so there are a whole bunch of different proposals. Some involve the government itself setting up regulatory standards. Some involve some kind of third-party verification. But having something, and that could be model codes, it could be the equivalent of nutritional labels. There's kind of a whole range of options there. But at the moment, I think a lot of people are sort of flying blind.
Yeah, could you say more about that last one? What sort of is this sort of the evaluations and monitoring thing, or you're talking about certification? Yeah, I'm kind of lumping together like a couple of different things here, but basically the idea that in many other areas, when we have technology that will be in some way consequential, there are either hard and fast legal requirements that systems, regulatory requirements that systems have to clear. So before a car is roadworthy or a drug, can be used legally, or there are third-party bodies that have some kind of standard setting so that a user who doesn't understand the field in detail will be able to look at something and say, yes, I can use this, let's say, without huge risk to my health. And there are all kinds of different ways that this is interpreted in different industries. But at the moment, largely just because the widespread use of powerful machine learning systems is so recent, we don't really have an equivalent thing for AI. So the idea is potentially it might be premature because we just don't know what sort of regulatory regime we want. For the government to have strict requirements about exactly what sort of specifications LLMs need to meet before consumers can use them. Maybe we want to get to that at some point. But the thing that we could do earlier is just build an infrastructure, potentially a private infrastructure of people who are testing these models and understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and basically providing a health warning to users so that they understand what they're getting into when they use these models. And potentially then, once we have a much better idea about what we actually should require, then we can go ahead and do that, but that might be down the road.
Yeah, exactly. I actually don't really have strong thoughts from a sequencing perspective. Maybe we do want to begin with something that is binding government regulation. But I think at the very least, there should be something that users can use as a foothold to get a sense of when it's safe and responsible to use tools in certain contexts. And often there are sort of middle categories. So for instance, a lot of the guidance issued by NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology in the US, is not legally binding. But it is an agreed upon standard. So for instance, NIST released this AI risk management framework, which a lot of companies have found very helpful because they have sort of wanted to be able to say, we checked all of the boxes on this thing before using AI in a certain way. Again, it's not legally required that they do this, but I think a lot of entities were really concerned that they wanted to do something good. And when they Googled it, they found like 1,000 different papers about AI ethics. And some of them had to do with user responsibility and some of them had to do with the paperclipper. Yeah. And to someone who is doing compliance at like a mid-sized company, that's just like a lot to have to digest and deal with. And so whether it is something that is like binding regulation, like soft guidance from the government, some sort of third party, obviously there you'd have to make sure that it wasn't sort of like industry capture. But I think that there needs to be something that the average user can interact with without reading a treatise on, how to interpret the activations in the hidden layers of neurons, in these systems, so that they can have confidence when they interact with these things, just like we do with all the other sophisticated technology that we use all the time, planes and cars and computers and phones and so on.
Yeah. Okay, turning back to the first thing you mentioned, which is this sort of a democratic consultation or getting public feedback. There is something that is quite bananas about the situation that we're in right now, where there's this community. You're anticipating what I might say here, but so there's this community of, I guess the order of magnitude is about 10,000 scientists, many of whom believe that they are on the verge of transforming the world completely and potentially bringing about, luxury, gay space, fully automated communism within our lifetimes. Yes. And no one's really been asked whether they want this. I mean, I guess this work is mostly happening in the US and UK. So as I can tell, voters haven't really been told about this plan or asked how they feel about it in those countries, let alone anywhere else. Yes. So, what about you're a subsistence farmer in Mozambique, and now your world might be completely turned upside down because it might not be possible for humans to make money anymore, or at least science might advance at such a massive rate that the world will become incomprehensible potentially within your lifetime. Yes. And at what point are you going to be asked whether this is what you want for your species? Do you have any more thoughts on what I mean, I don't think it's not necessarily a criticism of OpenAI or that research community, because I suppose they just aren't. This is a very weird circumstance. Mostly scientists don't have to do this because what they're doing is more straightforwardly good. And in a sense, if you're doing research to come up with better treatments for cancer, in a sense, the public does know that you're doing this and kind of has been consulted. We've just barreled forward into quite a different situation with AI, and it's much less clear what consequences are going to result. And they're just the public, things haven't been kept up at all.
Yes. Yeah. So I completely agree with that characterization. I would say, there are many factors that make this unusual. One is that things progress so quickly. So again, if you were a machine learning researcher in 2016, maybe you were just doing the nerdy thing that you wanted to do because you'd always enjoyed programming. And now all of a sudden you think that you are potentially part of a small community that's on the brink of building this potentially history, world-changing thing. And the community is not representative and it doesn't really know what most people want and so on. So all of the problems that you identified are accurate. Another thing that's challenging is that from a government perspective, because AI is so general, it doesn't tidily map to sort of the taxonomy of issue areas that government has grown around. Yeah. So it's hard to say, where do you, there's no clear agency or authority.
Of, exactly. Do we want to completely transform society in the next 20 years?
Exactly. And this will affect all of these areas of products and science and daily life and so on, right? It's like so, it's almost sort of like too broad and deep to grapple with using the tools that we've traditionally used. The punchline that I find most interesting is this idea that perhaps AI itself can help us build some of the tools that are needed to have these conversations. But I would say, I'll say maybe one other thing from a framing perspective, which is that in some ways, this problem is just a more extreme manifestation of things that are actually quite pervasive now as the world has become more sophisticated and more specialized and government remit has grown. All of us use things all the time that we basically have no idea how they work. And that creates a whole bunch of questions. Yeah, exactly, magnets. What's going on there?
Sorry, carry on.
And so AI is a particularly extreme example here. But I would say it is a difference in degree rather than a difference in kind. And there are many ways that potentially AI could help us have deep and meaningful conversations at scale about a host of topics, including things like how AI should be developed and what use cases should be prioritized and what dangers are the most worrisome and so on. And happy to get into detail on any of that if it's useful.
Yeah, well, I suppose I want to It'd be great if AI could help us with this challenge, I suppose, because there's a lot of work to be done potentially and not very long to do it in.
Yes.
But it seems like we should maybe also have a track of doing it the normal way.
Yes.
Finding out what people think in case the AI thing is maybe a bit of a red herring.
Yes.
And yeah, I guess, I mean, people could push back and say, actually, this is better left to the scientists because they have a better sense of what the trade-offs are here, and maybe just involving ordinary people who have no particular expertise in AI and haven't thought about this at all. Maybe it could just produce worse decisions. You could always kind of make an argument that this is very specialized work. I can see that. I also think, given how much people are going to be affected, it doesn't feel legitimate to me to do these things without consulting with people, even if that might slow things down substantially, or even if there is some risk that they might make mistakes, even by their own lights after the fact. Is there anything more prosaic that you think should be done in terms of public consultation?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me maybe I jumped too quickly to my sort of like techno-utopian vision, and I should say for the record that part of why I'm interested in working on that stuff is because I think there are about a million ways that like well-intentioned techno-utopian approaches to this can go wrong, and like even the best ones like raise some tricky questions. So absolutely, there are like loads of more prosaic things that can be done. So for instance, these alignment assemblies that the Collective Intelligence Project has run so far, I mean, they've used an online platform, but mostly they're held the way that citizens' assemblies have been held for a very long time. There's kind of been this resurgence and interest in citizens' assemblies. Helen Landemore has done a bunch of cool work there. I'd also point to Danielle Allen, who's done some really cool things. I think that you previously interviewed Audrey Tang, who has led a bunch of projects in Taiwan, some of which are more sort of tech forward and some of which are less tech forward, that involve sort of broadening the avenues for public participation in decision making, including decisions about complicated technical topics like disease spread. There's a big consultation about exactly how to regulate ride-sharing services like Uber. All of these things are in some ways more complicated than the ways that we in our daily life will interact with these topics. I think a lot of this is execution dependent. There are unproductive ways to run conversations like this, and there are productive ways to run conversations like this. There's been a lot of cool research showing how to increase the likelihood of sort of falling into camp two. How do you make it healthy? How do you set up an environment where people can engage with topics in which they don't have expertise, but come out of it having expressed preferences that, like, on reflection, they would actually endorse? And that does not need to involve any sort of like fancy technology. Like, there are lots of approaches. The promise of technology is maybe you can do this in perhaps a deeper and more scalable way. But again, those are differences of degree, not differences of kind. And so absolutely, there are all kinds of ways that I think like we can and should be doing more public consultations.
Yeah. The mechanism here that's always made the most intuitive sense to me is citizens' juries. So I guess the nightmare scenario that you might envisage for a big public discussion about AI is having all 330 million people in the United States spend 5 minutes thinking about AI and then kind of offer their opinion in a comments thread. Yeah. The thing that does sound quite good to me, and probably like it would lead to useful insights, would be, what if we got 1,000 or possibly even 100 randomly selected people from across the US population? You'd have some sort of jury summons, basically, and you would pay those people a salary to think about this full time for months or years, to learn everything and to hear from all of the different people and their different views about what should happen and why, and then talk among themselves in order to produce some idea of, well, what would a representative sample of people across the country? I mean, ideally, maybe you'll do this across the whole world as well. You could sample 1,000 people from all countries across the world in proportion to their population, and then find out, well, what do they think that the trade-off that we ought to accept should be across safety versus risk versus delay versus speed up versus, a potential reward? I have no idea what would come out of that, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe sort of like an abstract framing here that I think is imperfect, but would be a starting point, is that people tend to have a pretty good sense, if you can paint a picture for them of what possible future worlds look like. People will have relatively sort of like well-informed preferences on how much they would value each of those. The challenge comes in figuring out what policy and technical tooling will sort of like mediate the achievement of those worlds. And so this is where you have a lot of sort of depressing results about the fact that people vote for policies that are not in their interests, not out of a sense of nobility, but because they mistakenly believe that they're in their interests. And this, I think, like fuels a lot of sort of historical anti-democratic arguments, many of which take the general form of, maybe once upon a time democracy made sense, but now the world is too complicated and you simply cannot trust a randomly selected citizen or group of citizens to make decisions about something as complicated as AI policy, nuclear policy, regulating the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Personally, I'm like not nearly that fatalistic. I think that there are lots of ways, some of which involve using fancy AI things and some of which don't, that you can set the stage for conversations that enable people to do that mapping in a well-informed way, right? So enable you to kind of like extract truly well-informed reflective preferences from people, even about domains in which they don't necessarily have pre-existing subject matter expertise. Part of the promise of AI in these settings is the idea that, it's easy to imagine, for instance, non-hallucinating LLMs that are relatively unbiased and well-informed on sort of the relevant areas of scientific expertise, helping individuals navigate this thicket of sort of mediating levers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the argument that the world is too complicated technically for people to understand it is, I think, quite a compelling argument against direct democracy. I think it's a much weaker argument against representative democracy, where you do have people working full time in order to try to build enough expertise in these areas in order to make decisions. I mean, of course, there's still lots of challenges there, and weaknesses and mistakes are going to be made, but we have representative democracy in many countries now, and it seems to work reasonably well. And so we might hope that it could work reasonably well in this case as well. And the citizens' juries, I guess, is an alternative structure for representative democracy that I guess is aiming more to represent the values of ordinary people, or to bring, and potentially also to bring the expertise that they do have to the table. I mean, you could imagine, if the concern is a lack of technical understanding is going to hold this group back, what if you had that 100 people, they just summoned expert witnesses like for years, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, they have people giving them briefs, so they call in people, experts from all across the ML field. I think what they would come away with is that there's an awful lot of disagreement here, and they can't tell who has the right read on how great the risks are, and they would have to make a decision on that basis, which is the same situation that, in fact, I think we are basically all in, that there's an enormous amount of expert disagreement, and that leaves us in a difficult situation. Nonetheless, we have to act.
Yeah, I think that's right. So maybe to step back and sort of give an abstract framing, there are some, even in areas of high uncertainty, there are some approaches or institutions that seem to have like better predictive track records than others. And so like Robin Hanson has this proposal for Futalky, which the tagline is vote on values, bet on beliefs. And the idea is that you elect representatives, and what they're in charge of doing is essentially creating the national objective function. And that's going to be some combination of, let's say, GDP and Gini coefficient and, environmental well-being and the quality of education and all of this. And you elect people based on the values that they profess, and they sort of hash out how to integrate all of these things into a single metric. And then policies are proposed, and you defer to markets, to prediction markets, which policies are adopted. And essentially the question that you're posing to the market is something along the lines of, will this increase this national objective measure like better than the alternative, where the counterfactual is like not implementing it. And so like in principle, this is a nice idea in that it sort of like separates this values component and this prediction component. In practice, I think that actually those two things are sort of almost hopelessly intertwined, and untangling that requires a lot of like very, very fine-grained work. To what extent do you want something to happen because it reflects like a value of yours, versus to what extent do you want it to happen because you think it's the means to another end? I think that like that act of unraveling those factors is a very difficult one, and is one that productive conversations can achieve pretty well. And so this is where you get, I think, like sort of the value of something like citizen assemblies shows up, or conceivably something where you're interacting with a scalable automated system that also helps you sort of digest which things you want and why. And then perhaps handles the mapping of that to expectation over a set of policies that like may or may not produce those outcomes.
Yeah. I guess coming back to the here and now, do you have any suggestions for how the AI Bill of Rights proposal in the US or the EU AI Act, how they might be improved, or areas where you'd like to see them changed?
Yeah, so I very much liked the Bill of Rights. I mean, the challenge there, of course, is that it has, much like some of this NIST stuff we were talking about, there is no component of it that is legally binding. So it is, and the reason why it's titled like the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights is because it is in some ways an aspirational document that outlines the kinds of things that people should be able to expect from these systems. But no producers of AI products are currently in any way bound by this stuff. And so in the long run, like I suspect we will want to, in a legal or regulatory way, instantiate those aims more fully. Another thing I'll say about both the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights and the EU AI Act is, as is the case with, I think, almost any of these documents, they are not comprehensive solutions to all AI-related harms. So both of those focus overwhelmingly on questions of, with capabilities that exist today or will exist in the very near future, what are the kinds of day-to-day challenges that people in society have or will have in using them, as opposed to questions about, let's say, alignment of superintelligence. That's like almost entirely absent from these frameworks. So I think that they are sort of addressing a subset of problems. I think that the Bill of Rights does it quite well, with the caveat that it isn't super binding. I have not read the latest set of amendments. When I was in the White House, I did do a fair amount of coordination work with the EU on AI issues. But the AI Act is still under construction. And I think that just this past month, they either proposed or approved a new slate of amendments. And in total, the number that's being proposed is I think several thousand. So I cannot claim expertise in having read all of this stuff. But the big concern that some people have flagged with the AI Act is the classic regulatory concern of will this discourage innovation and so on. I haven't really seen any definitive signs that would be the case, but I don't have huge confidence when speaking about the AI Act. So.
Is the plan with the AI Bill of Rights that we're starting with this kind of voluntary framework, or basically foreshadowing what the legal requirements might be in the future, with the goal of seeing how that goes, and then at some future time, once we have better understanding of what's technically possible, then that could be made binding?
Yeah, I am not sure if there is an official and universally agreed upon US government position on that. I know from speaking to some people who worked on that in government that, well, I know a lot of people, both within government and outside, hoped that was the trajectory it would take. I also know other people who are much more sort of regulation shy, who are much more in favor of something that's sort of very laissez-faire and just let the market figure things out and so on. Personally, I'm a little bit more in the former camp than the latter, but I am not sure what the latest consolidated government position is, if there is one.
Yeah. It's very unclear to me how responsibility for the consequences of AI, how that's split across various different parts of the US government. It feels a bit like there's no identifiable actor who really has to think about this holistically. Is that right?
Yes, this is true. And in part, this gets back to this issue of AI is A, new, B, so general that it challenges the taxonomy of government stuff, and C, something that government has not until recently engaged with meaningfully in its current form. So, various government research projects throughout time have used some kind of AI, but government was not really in any meaningful way driving the past decade of machine learning progress. And all of this means that there are a ton of open questions about how government thinks about AI-related responsibilities and where those sit.
Okay, so who are the different players, though, who at least are responsible for some aspect of this?
So within the White House, the sort of main groups would be the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I worked before. That within it has a number of different teams, several of which are quite interested in AI. There is one small group that is explicitly dedicated to AI. There is a national security team, that was where I sat, that handles a lot of AI-related things. And then there is the Science and Society team. That was the team that produced the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. Each of these groups, they work together quite a fair bit, and each one has sort of a slightly different outlook and set of priorities related to AI. Then you have the National Security Council, which has a tech team within it that also handles a fair amount of AI stuff. At the highest level, OSDP historically has been a bit more long-run, conceptual, research-y, putting together sort of big plans for, what the government's position should be on approach to funding cures for a given disease, let's say. And the NSC has traditionally been a bit more close to the decision-making of senior leaders, and that has the benefit of, in some immediate sense, being higher impact, but also being more reactive and less long-run thinking-wise. Again, these huge generalizations. But those are sort of two of the groups within the White House that are especially concerned about AI. These days, of course, because AI is on everyone's mind, every single imaginable bit of the government has released some statement that references AI. But in terms of the groups that sort of have large responsibility for it, then, of course, there is the whole world of departments and agencies, all of which have sort of different AI-related equities. So you can imagine that, there's NIST, which I mentioned earlier, which does regulatory stuff. There's National Science Foundation, which of course funds a fair amount of AI-related research. There's the Department of Energy, which runs the national labs. And so the name is is slightly misleading because they don't just do energy stuff.
They mostly do nuclear.
Exactly.
Nuclear
so
issues, right?
exactly. So it's sort of funny because I think from the outside, this is actually something I didn't really appreciate until I came into government. My understanding of like the US bureaucracy was pretty limited. I think in part because of missing some of the, I didn't do all of my schooling in the US. So the sort of basic civic education stuff, a lot of it that people learn when they're like 8, I didn't learn until I was sort of like living it in this job. And so one of these things is that, the Department of Energy is like actually this incredibly powerful and like really, really big organization that in my mind, I thought like, they do like wind farms and things. But it turns out that because they're in charge of like a lot of nuclear development and security, they actually, especially in the national security space, like have quite a lot of authority and a very large budget. Of course, in addition to all the stuff in the executive, then there's Congress, which has like at various times sort of like thrown various AI related provisions into these like absolutely massive bills and stuff. I think that so far they have, I believe like both the House and the Senate have AI focused committees or groups of some kind. I'm not super clear on what they're doing, but obviously there is also the potential for AI related like legislation. So anyway, the list goes on. As you can imagine, obviously like the Department of Defense and the intelligence community also do various like AI related projects. But at the moment there isn't sort of a clear coordinating entity. There have been a number of proposals. One of this ones that's been in the news has been sort of Sam Altman suggested during his testimony that there be a new agency created to like focus specifically on AI. I think it remains to be determined like whether that happens and what that looks like.
I think I asked this question of Holden a couple of interviews back. Imagine that there was some kind of warning shot. There was some disaster in which AI were involved. I guess it could be a misalignment issue where an AI goes rogue on a medium-sized scale, or potentially a misuse case where AI is used to help someone to do a lot of damage or kill a lot of people. And let's say, and then it was like very broadly agreed that we really needed the government to say, get into the labs that were producing this very dangerous software, basically, and lock it down or change it in some way. Like basically, action had to be taken because we'd realized that it was substantially more dangerous than what we had realized the previous week. Who in government has the authority or the responsibility to do that? Does anyone have that ability?
So I've read a few, and I should say this isn't an area that I did any direct work on. So, don't read too much into my responses. I've read a few sort of public analyses of like what authorities exist under various doctrines. So, for instance, there's this thing like the Defense Production Act, which it's not quite nationalization, but it enables the president to direct existing entities to work on a specific thing. So this was used, if I remember correctly, during World War II, where a bunch of like car manufacturers and stuff were told to like make military kit. And it was also, Trump actually invoked it during COVID to get a couple of companies to like, I think make ventilators
right.
I don't remember all of the details. But I think there are some questions about like, could the DPA be used to in some forceful way direct AI companies to do certain types of research or not do certain types of research? If I remember correctly, the paper that I read said probably not, or it probably wouldn't be able to like achieve, when some people say like, well, the government could just like, quote, nationalize the AI companies. It seems that like the DPA authorities are a little bit limited.
Could the government direct everyone at one of the research labs to just play solitaire all day?
Right. Yeah. Yes. This is a good,
this is an interesting legal case. Yeah.
Exactly. This sounds like a fun one for the Supreme Court to deal with. But so yeah, jumping back to the Holden question, I think to a significant degree, given the sort of current taxonomy of issue areas within government, it would depend on what the nature of the incident was. So is it an incident that, like, first and foremost is a cybersecurity vulnerability? Is it a lab that is doing something that is interacting with the real world in ways that cause physical harm, which might be the remit of anything from, the local fire department to the FBI or the National Guard or something. So I think that in part, I don't think that the answer is there is no capability to respond or no set of authorities. But I think it is that at the moment, the relevant authorities are totally fragmented because they are not built around a foundation of like thinking about AI related risks. And so I am relatively optimistic that if something really bad happened or seemed like it was going to happen, there is something that could be done. But under current infrastructure, there will probably be a fair amount of confusion in the beginning about which authorities to use and how and why and what kind of coordination would be needed.
Yeah. Because how would it be different if a lab was enthusiastic to have government involvement? Then maybe this becomes a lot easier because you can just have conversations and then things get done without you having to necessarily have legal authority to force something to happen.
Yeah.
And you might imagine that in this situation, people might be very happy to volunteer. They might think that, actually, we're a little bit more out of our depth than what we'd appreciated. So we want to get more people into the meeting here.
Exactly. So like, I think one big question at the moment is to what extent in terms of these questions about how can you keep models safe, there are a number of industries, including areas that are sort of like direct, let's say, defense contractors, but also just other domains of research that are understood to be sensitive, where the government in some way assists with security to prevent the kind of thing we were talking about earlier. So theft of IP that could be dual use IP by foreign governments, for instance, or for-profit hackers or what have you. I think there's a whole spectrum of ways that like government and industry could collaborate on things like that. And I'm not especially well versed in like what the precedents are.
Within this broader ecosystem of thinking about ways that AI might change the world, worrying about ways it could go wrong, and trying to push us towards a better direction, there's many different interest groups or many different specific concerns that partially overlap with one another, but are different. Of course, there's the people who are worried about extinction. There's people who are worried about misalignment. There's people worried about misuse. There's people who are worried about consumer protection now. There's people who are worried about ways that AI could be deployed that would change society in subtle ways that would be bad and add up over time. I guess analogous perhaps to ways that social media might have gradually worsened things. All kinds of different, I guess, there's the national security folks. There's people concerned about cybersecurity. And I think kind of all of them have some legitimate points and legitimate concern. One doesn't have to pick one of these and say this is the issue and the others aren't. There could be many different potential problems at different points. It would be really nice to find policy ideas that are appealing to a whole lot of these different groups at once, so that you can get, to some extent, we might have an issue where there are so many different potential problems that the ecosystem is incredibly fragmented, all trying to address different legitimate worries, but never quite coalescing enough around any particular proposals to get them over the line. And so it's potentially you need a bit of coalition building here, saying, well, here's a policy that would help with 3 out of these 10 groups. So let's talk about this for a bit. And this is good by all of our lights. Oh, and also maybe the other 7 don't object to it. They all think that it's a worse neutral. And then you can try to push that over the line politically, and then move on to something that can address the other 7 together. I suppose one that came up in an interview with Ezra Klein was, I think I asked, what's something that could be put into the bill, the AI Bill of Rights, or some piece of legislation today that's about consumer protection from AI right now that could also be relevant to extinction risk? And one that jumps out there is potentially interpretability, or the one that seems most plausible is interpretability, where we would both really like to understand what these models are thinking now in order to make sure that they don't fail in bad ways and harm users or companies today. But improving then the technology of doing that will probably help us with all kinds of other issues down the road. Are there any others that stand out now as potentially being useful in a cross-cutting way now, or any other proposals down the line that might seem like they address multiple different concerns simultaneously?
I definitely agree on interpretability. I think you're right. I think you're right both that there is maybe tension between some of these proposals and communities at the moment that need not be as fierce as it is. But also that at some level, like, there may be trade-offs if you have a pot of money and it's X number of dollars and that needs to be split across a couple of different priorities. Like, obviously at some level, like a dollar goes to one thing will come at the cost of another. I think that obviously one approach is just to expand the pie in some way. And so I think that increased public funding for the full gamut of alignment issues, ethics research, better benchmarking, and so on is kind of a no-brainer. Obviously, there's such a thing as spending too much money on that, but I think we're just so far away from that at the moment that you could go very far without it becoming a problem. I think everyone can agree on the need to expand the pie. And then the question of how do you slice it up? That is an area where I think, to invoke the democratic principle, you might be able to agree on something procedurally, even if you don't agree on it at the object level. And so I think that that's an area where there is probably more legitimacy attached with saying everyone agreed that we wanted to expand the pie, and then we made allocation decisions based not just on like some set of government technocrats or on some like moneyed interests that were lobbying or on some very visible PR campaign, but on a process widely seen as legitimate. Maybe that's something that involves like a citizens' assembly, like we were talking about earlier, that tries to sort of gather public perceptions about which things they're actually the most worried about.
Yeah. One other suggestion I've heard for something that should be viewed as good by the likes of many of these different interest groups is cybersecurity. So since cybersecurity looks really good from a national security point of view, because you really don't want dangerous technology leaking out to terrorists or to adversary states potentially. It's really good from an extinction risk point of view. I guess probably at least all the other groups either think it's good or neutral.
Yeah.
I don't imagine that there's anyone who thinks that preventing hacking of these things, or I don't know, eventually I'm sure it's a big world and people have all kinds of different views. But I would guess that most people either think that that's really good or at worst neutral. So that seems like one where you could potentially build quite a broad coalition around requiring extremely high cybersecurity for frontier AI models potentially.
Yeah, I think it's totally right, actually. Yeah, I agree with that. I guess there's like a long list of sort of AI application areas that almost nobody would say are bad. So, for instance, using AI to help develop cures for like really dangerous diseases, using AI to improve like cyber defenses, stuff like that. But I think that's maybe like at a slightly different level of abstraction than sort of like the category of policies that we're talking about.
Well, I guess improving the methods that we have for keeping models on track in terms of what goals they're pursuing and why, as they become substantially more capable, that is kind of one of the main thrusts of the extinction-focused work that I think that at least NatSec people would also think is probably good. And I would think that AI ethics people would also think is probably good. I guess I don't know of anyone who really objects to that line of research. At worst, they might think it's a bit of a waste of resources or something if they don't think it's promising.
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe another one that would be interesting is sort of improvements to privacy-preserving machine learning infrastructure and techniques. So that's an area where potentially you can reduce so these are techniques like differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation, and federated learning that give you some level of privacy guarantee about saying you can train a model on data in ways that don't have to give the model owner repeatable, interpretable access to the data, nor give the data owner repeatable, interpretable access to the model, but still you get the benefits of like model improvement at the end of the day. And historically, these have usually had a sort of like big additional cost computationally. There are some interesting groups, most notably OpenMind, which is an open source community that is developing a library called PySift that is trying to sort of reduce the computational cost of those systems. There are a lot of areas where we would like to have the sort of public benefits of stuff that is trained on sensitive data, but we don't want to compromise individuals' personal information. So some of the most obvious ones here are medical use cases, where it would be great to have systems that are trained on the distributed, let's say, mammography data in order to improve tumor detection. But completely understandably, people don't want to hand their sensitive healthcare information over to for-profit companies. There are also a whole bunch of other applications, including actually model governance itself, and like how can you deploy systems that will assess the capabilities of certain models or the size of training runs or what have you without getting any other sort of creepy surveillance data from that stuff. So there is a whole world of possibilities in this direction that could be helpful for developing models that would have to be trained on sensitive data and or handling governance responsibilities that might otherwise bring surveillance implications that make us uncomfortable. I think that is a technical stack that is under development now, but where lots more work could be done. And the overwhelming majority of the use cases that it enables, at least the ones that like I have come across, are quite positive. So that might be another area that there would be like shared interest in developing.
Yeah. Maybe another possible option is something around immigration reform, where, well, I suppose maybe not everyone would be in favor of this, but it's pretty crazy if there's people who can do very useful work who are stuck in India and can't get a visa to come to the United States to collaborate with the people they need to collaborate with.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that like I would put high skill immigration reform as one of the sort of like no-brainer policies. And this is an area that I don't claim any expertise in. I knew basically nothing about before starting this job at OSTP, and then ended up working on a few issues related to this. So I know like just enough to be dangerous. But overall, it's just like astounding the degree to which the United States does not make use of sort of this latent superpower, which is the fact that like a huge number of people want to move there. And it is, unfortunately, the sort of immigration system is so baroque and limited and confusing that a very, very high proportion of people who would in so many ways contribute to the United States, economically, culturally, and so on, are effectively prohibited from going there. And this is something that, again, I can imagine conceivable reasons why someone would be opposed to it. Like,
it could speed things,
exactly. So will it accelerate like capabilities research? So it's not like robust to every single worldview, but I think it is quite close to being sort of like a no-brainer policy. Not least because, as it turns out, there's this kind of meme of brain drain, but it turns out that the reality is actually quite complicated and often goes the opposite way, which people sometimes call like brain gain, because you get, well, there are a whole bunch of different mechanisms, but you have knowledge remittances, actual remittances, all kinds of like sort of ongoing collaborations and so on that mean that quite often it's the case that the country that people leave will often actually end up benefiting economically from those people's departure because of the things that they subsequently bring back or send to people who are still in their home country.
Just talk a bit about the relationship between people who are focused on extinction risk and people who are focused on AI ethics.
Yeah.
I brought this up in the interview with Ezra Klein, and I've just set it up a little bit again for people who didn't hear that. That interview was it was quite brief, so we didn't get to explore it in full detail. But the thing that I said there was, I guess I actually have a rule that I don't read people bickering online almost, especially not on Twitter. So I actually have not encountered any of the harsh words that have been exchanged between that I've heard have been exchanged between people who have these different focuses. But I don't really understand why there would be much tension between these groups in principle, because they're working on different problems, but many people in the world are working on different problems, and people working on extinction risk or AI ethics or like kind of present day AI concerns, they're not angry with people who are working to cure cancer because they're working on a different problem. They're just working on different things that all could be useful. And I guess I haven't looked into the AI ethics stuff in great detail, but my guess is that there's just really legitimate worries there that make complete sense from any ordinary standpoint, and that government should be legislating in that area in order to try to address that, or at least AI labs should be trying to address those concerns, just for all of the normal prosaic reasons that we try to make products better and try to reduce bias and prejudice and so on. The place where I could see where you could have tension between different groups is when Group 1 has some policy proposal which Group 2 thinks is actively harmful, or there is some competition over a fixed amount of resources. And I guess I'm not aware of cases of the former where the extinction-focused community is pushing for some policy that the AI ethics community is actively bad, or vice versa. And you can imagine that now or in the future there could be competition over grants and so on. But at the moment, it seems like there's just a lot of degrees of freedom on how much funding there might be. And if you can point to more different ways in more different problems related to AI, then you could just potentially get more funding to address all of these different concerns. If there was only one stream of concern, then I imagine that there would be less interest and less funding than there would otherwise be. So I suppose I would beg people to ask this question at all points in time, and I guess this is particularly notable with these two groups right now, but also just with any other communities that you're interfacing with, are they proposing stuff that I think is merely useless, or like useless at worst? In which case, it's just like everything else that you're not particularly passionate about. There's no reason why you have to be talking with them about it, because presumably out in the world, there's many people doing stuff that you don't love, but you mostly just walk on by and don't email them about it. Or are they proposing stuff, or potentially actually are there policies that both of us would be in favor of, in which case they become allies, even if you have different empirical views or different views about what would be optimal? Do you have a take on this overall situation?
Yeah. So I have maybe sort of a few low confidence thoughts. So one is, there are some areas where there is, I think, the perception of some finite resource, and maybe that's money, or maybe it's attention. And I think there is an understandable concern on the AI ethics side that there is sometimes a totalizing quality to the way that some people worry about existential risks. And that can, at its best, I think that stuff is, X-risk concern is expressed in ways that are like appropriately caveated and so on. And I think at its worst, it can be sort of, it can imply that nothing else matters because of sort of like running some set of hypothetical numbers. Personally, like I'm sort of a bit of a pluralist, and so I don't think that like everything comes down to utils. And I think that the outlook of if you reduce existential risk by X%, then this so dwarfs every other concern is something that I can see why that rubs people the wrong way. A second thing that I think sometimes brings some of these views or these communities into conflict is the idea that there are some types of behavior, whether that's from labs or proposed policies, that could help. I'm in particular thinking of things that would have some security benefits that people who are concerned about X risk value very highly, but that might come at the cost of other things that we value in a pluralistic society. So, for instance, openness and competition. A lot of the policies that we haven't talked about yet, because so far we've been focusing on sort of no-brainer, almost everyone should get behind these. There are a lot of very tricky ones that you can see a case for and you can see a case against, and often they pit these values against one another. If you're really, really, really worried about existential risk, then it's better to have fewer entities that are coordinating stuff and to have those be like fairly consolidated and to work very closely with the government. If you don't take existential risk that seriously, and if instead you are comparatively more worried about having a flourishing and open scientific ecosystem, making sure that small players can have access to sort of like cutting edge models and capabilities, and so on. And a lot of these things historically have correlated with like the health of open and distributed societies. Then those policies look really, really different. And I think that the question of how do we grapple with these sort of like competing interests is a really difficult one. And I worry that at its worst, the X-risk community, which broadly I should say, like I think like does like lots of excellent work and like has put its finger on like very, very, very real concerns. But I think at its worst, there can be this sort of like totalizing attitude that maybe refuses to grapple with a different set of frameworks for like assessing these issues. And I think that's sometimes exacerbated by the fact that it is, on average, not a super representative community, geographically or ethnically and what have you. And I think that means that it's easy to be blind to some of the things that other people, for good reason, are worried about. That would be like, I guess, my sort of like very high level framing of it. But the bottom line is that I very much agree with your sentiment that like most of the conflict between these groups is like counterproductive. And there is a huge amount of, if we're talking about the difference between like pie splitting and pie expansion, there's a huge amount of pie expansion and a whole bunch of policies that should be in sort of the collective interest. And I'd very much encourage people, especially since I think this is the listenership here is probably a little bit more sort of like EA skewed. Like I'd very much encourage people to engage with, I mean, this sounds so trite, but like, yeah, like really, really to listen to some of the claims from the non-X-risk AI ethics community, because like there is a lot of very valuable stuff there and sort of like very, and different, it's just kind of like a different perspective on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think on the non-representativeness, it seems all of these groups seem just phenomenally unrepresentative of the global population as a whole. I mean, to start with, basically everyone has a degree or a higher degree.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost everyone speaks English.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it's almost, it's actually extraordinary once you think about that these things have such global implications, and yet the people making it are basically, the differences between them are so small.
Absolutely.
The differences between them that seem large to them are tiny on a global scale.
Yes, absolutely. But as is so often the case, it's like those are the
tyranny of
the tyranny of small differences, or whatever it is. I always found that the people that get the most on my nerves are the people that I'm worried I am. Okay. And so I think that it is often there is like some uncanny valley of people who are doing something that seems like very, very similar to what you're doing, but maybe it's slightly different, or you're worried that that's how you yourself come across or something like that. So,
On the point about that, there does just seem to be potentially quite a tough trade-off between the security and the openness. That does just seem like a real trade-off there, that it's going to be very hard to satisfy groups that are concerned about who prioritize each of those things at once. I mean, there's going to be some win-wins, I'm sure. There'll be some cases where potentially cybersecurity would be one, where that one group thinks that that's good and the other group thinks that that's fine, maybe good as well, for instance. But there will be some cases where what's better on one view is worse on the other, pretty often. It seems very hard in deciding which way to go on that, to put aside the technical questions of how likely is misalignment, how likely is extinction on our current path. If you think that the odds of extinction from the status quo is 1 in 10,000, then it makes sense to really prioritize the openness and going quickly and making sure that no individual group becomes too powerful. If you think it's 1 in 2, then that seems crazy. And instead, you should be treating this with extreme caution. And these other issues around competition law seem minor by comparison to 4 billion expected deaths. I'm not sure. I kind of just don't know that there's going to be any way of settling this other than empirically investigating the question of how likely are we all to die,
yes,
and getting at least to the same order of magnitude, roughly, of understanding of how likely that is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this is the kind of thing that crops up in like lots of policy areas, which is that things will be framed in some discrete way when in reality they're continuous and a matter of degree. And so we can look at, for instance, like a big debate in the US has to do with gun rights. And it's often pitted or framed as this question of, like liberty versus security. And in reality, it's clearly a spectrum. Like almost nobody thinks a private citizen should be able to buy a hydrogen bomb, right? And almost nobody thinks that like nobody should be able to buy a kitchen knife. And somewhere in between that, I think when you press on it, these things do, like you were just describing, become empirical issues, right? How much harm is done by this thing versus how much, freedom is a little bit like harder to quantify, but you can give people different scenarios in terms of, how they'd feel about like having access to this, how much worse it would make their life if they couldn't buy thing X. And so almost inevitably, these are trade-offs that exist along some kind of spectrum. And I think there are similar questions here, which is to say, now the challenge, of course, here, as opposed to, let's say, the issue around gun rights is that there are reams of data on how many people guns kill, whereas when it comes to AI risk, there are all of these very difficult epistemic questions, like what does it even mean when we put a probability on something that hasn't happened yet? And that's not to say that there is no rigor that can be brought to it, but obviously that makes it more difficult. And it makes it easier for people never to converge in their estimates.
Yeah. I guess everyone who gets very head up about these issues, I've been using this technique where if I read something that I find very frustrating, I think, would this make sense if I thought the risk of extinction due to AI was 1 in 10,000?
Yeah.
And then I'll go like, okay, yes, then it would make sense. And the reason that I find this very frustrating is that I think the risk is many orders of magnitude larger than that. Yes. And so it sounds absolutely batshit. Yeah. so that's absolutely insane. And basically, I imagine the exact same is true on the reverse, where people will read something and think, this is so oppressive, or this would involve changes to the law that are completely unacceptable to me. Then they think, well, what if I thought the risk of me and my family being killed by this thing was 1 in 2, then, well, maybe I would be willing to accept that trade-off.
Yes.
And I don't think this is going to lead people to agree necessarily, but would at least lead people to understand roughly where other people are coming from.
Yeah. I think that's right. I do like the idea of like the ideological Turing test, and before sort of relegating an idea to the dustbin, one should be able to come up with like what is the strongest justification of this. And I think often it does the difference does come down to sort of like what are the estimates that you put on different like on different events, on different possible scenarios. And maybe one other thing here is that there is this question, so like Holden has written this stuff on how likely should we think it is that this is the most important century? And like on the one hand, we have these fundamental reasons to think like, yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening. On the other hand, the prior should be like incredibly low because loads of people historically thought they were in the most important century. And most of the time we look back and we think, that thing actually like really didn't matter that much. And so I think similarly here, there are these sort of competing claims of on the one hand, we look at these curves of capability, and it seems like there is crazy stuff on the horizon, and there are so many ways that it can go wrong. And for machine learning in particular, compared to lots of other technology, we have so few guarantees about the types of guarantees that we want to have about performance. But on the other hand, if every time that people thought they were inventing the most important thing ever, we sort of gave them free rein and said, okay, well, we can put these like pluralistic considerations aside because like this matters so much, then we'd probably be in like a much worse world today than we are. And so, yeah, it's a really tricky tension. And I don't think that there will be a magic bullet. I think it is a question of like continuing to update based on evidence from the research frontier and really making ourselves stare these difficult trade-offs in the face and trying as much as possible to like bring people together who have like wildly different perspectives on the relative likelihood and importance of these issues.
We'll have some bad news on that point. I'm not sure whether you saw, there's some research that came out recently where I think it was one of Philip Tetlock's groups. I actually can't remember the name of the organization. I think they brought together super forecasters, so people who have a good track record of forecasting things, and experts in artificial intelligence and extinction risk, and got them to talk a long time to try to get on the same page about the risk of extinction. There was like no convergence.
Really? Oh, yeah, that's not good.
Okay, it's not good.
That's not good.
Yeah, I mean, something strange is going on. Because I think that's not typical. I think in most areas you do get convergence through conversation and sharing of information. It suggests to me that most of the work is being done by priors, and people are not like there is not shared empirical information that forces people to update in some particular direction. I mean, and that will just be a mill around our necks until we can get sufficient empirical information that people with different initial positions can converge at least somewhat
Yeah.
on their concerns.
I wonder, in some ways, this may get back to some of these questions around standards and benchmarks, which is obviously in the research community, there are, in fact, like loads of sort of well-developed benchmarks. But in particular, I don't think that we yet have a widely agreed upon set of safety and alignment benchmarks that we think are anywhere close to comprehensive. I know there are groups like ARC that are looking into sort of improving the way that we think about accreditation in that space. But my understanding, actually, one of the people that I worked with on my team at DeepMind is a certified super forecaster. And one of the projects we worked on was building an internal prediction competition. And I enjoyed learning from him quite a bit about sort of like how these things usually work. And it seems like they place quite a lot of emphasis on having very interpretable, agreed upon metrics to measure like whatever the thing is in question. And I'm not by any means convinced that like this would resolve the lack of convergence in this case, but I can imagine that like getting a better set of safety benchmarks that you can use all the way from like toy problems up to like really big and powerful things that everyone agrees kind of and understands like how they sit on this spectrum, that would maybe help resolve some of this. It would maybe reduce the like deference to priors a bit.
Yeah. What's one thing policymakers should understand about current AI technology that many of them don't?
I would say two things. One is how quickly research paradigms at the frontier change. A few years ago, almost everything was focused on deep RL in simulated environments. And that had worked really well on a set of problems. And now it's all about LLMs or multimodal, foundation models that are more or less just like souped up versions of a transformer. And this happens to be the paradigm that has like radically expanded public awareness of AI. And I think as a result, for a lot of people in the general public, including policymakers,
that's all there is.
That's all there is. Exactly. Like, AI equals machine learning equals foundation models equals LLMs. And obviously, in fact, that's sort of like a concentric set of things. And moreover, the track record is that this changes very, very rapidly. I worry that at the moment, if you have policies that sort of assume, that a foundation model is synonymous with like all of AI, you can end up on the back foot if you pass something, and then in 2 years' time, we're in a different research paradigm, even a different research paradigm within machine learning, akin to the transition from like deep RL to LLMs. So that would be one thing, is sort of becoming just a bit more familiar with the historical trends in this space.
Do you have any advice for technical experts on how to communicate better with policymakers? I suppose if you're someone with technical expertise in AI and you're called by some group to come to DC and help them understand things and come up with ideas, how should you be thinking about how to communicate? Yeah,
this is a great question. And this is actually something that like one area that I think LLMs could be very valuable is to go back to this parallel between translation across actual languages and translation across academic or professional vernaculars. I think that we could save a lot of time by fine-tuning systems to do better mappings of explain this technical AI concept to someone who is a trained lawyer. And often then you can actually find that there are sort of these weird overlaps, not necessarily like full isomorphisms, but like a lot of the conceptual tooling that people have in really different domains accomplishes similar things and can be repurposed to explain something in an area that they're not super familiar with. So this is an area where I think that like there is a lot of cool AI-driven work that can be done. In terms of practical advice to people trying to explain things, this is tricky because there are many ways in which, you want to frame things differently. And I'm trying to think of a set of like principles that capture these, because a lot of it is just like very specific word choice. Maybe a few off the top of my head would be, one, just try reading, like read political news and read some policy documents to get a feel for like how things are typically described. And that should like be a decent start. Two, I think in general in policy space, you want to reduce the use, obviously, of technical language, but even of sort of philosophical type abstraction that can be helpful in a lot of other domains. And so the more that things can be grounded in concrete concepts and also incentives that will be familiar to people. So in the policy space, a lot of that has to do with, think about what the domestic and foreign policy considerations are that are relevant to this. I mean, it obviously depends on the group. Like, is it a group of senators or people at OSTP or something? But like, broadly speaking, if you read political news, you'll get a sense of like what people care about. A lot of people are like really worried about competition with China, for better or worse. The more that you can sell something as being in service of an agreed upon priority. So like one to ground this, like one example here would be, to the extent that the framing of China competition is inevitable, one can harness that to make the case that, for instance, leading in AI safety is an area that could be excellent for like the scientific prestige of a country, right? And could like improve the brand of a place where things are done safely and reliably, and where you can trust services and so on. Like you can take something that otherwise a policymaker might dismiss as like heady techno-utopianism, and if you are willing to cheapen yourself a little bit in terms of how to sell it, you can get more attention. Obviously, this is a sliding scale, and you can, you don't want to take it too far. But I think a lot can be accomplished by thinking about like what the local political incentives are that people have.
Yeah. I suppose we might have an AI alignment race, and I suppose the UK, where there's £100 million of funding, it's going to win the AI alignment race unless...
Win the alignment race, exactly.
Is AI going to transform the labor market in the next few years? Lots of people are going to lose their jobs. I find myself going back and forth on this. It just seems... I suppose yesterday I was reading about this new extension to GPT-4 that allows it to do coding and data analysis. You just say, I'd like to learn, like to identify the causal effect of this on that, and you you upload literally a data set in a comma separated variable file, and it can do the stuff.
Yeah,
I'm just like, how can people not lose their jobs because of this? It seems amazing. And then, at least I haven't heard about lots of people losing their jobs this year so far. It's maybe been less than one might have thought when GPT-3 or when ChatGPT first came out. And you just think about all the bottlenecks in your own organization to using new technology and replacing people with bots, and how hard that might be. And you could think, well, this could actually drag out quite a long time. Models might be capable of doing things long before they're actually implemented in providing services directly. Yeah, did you have any take on this?
So, I mean, the first, I feel like 25% of what I've said in this interview has been disclaimers, but I'll throw in another disclaimer before saying this, which is that one thing I've learned from the more time I've spent in the AI space, the more I've learned not to trust my own predictions, or really almost anyone's predictions about like where things go. I mean, like at some level, I will sort of defer to the super forecasters, but it's just so hard to say how quickly things will progress. And it seems to me anecdotally as though on average, experts in the field are not significantly better at predicting these things than a randomly selected person. So, like, of course, I have like some very broad distribution of instincts here, but like, I won't with confidence make any prediction about like what unemployment will look like induced by AI in 5 years' time or something. But one thing I will note is something that I'm sure you've probably like read this series of papers, but Eric Brynjolfsson has written several papers that in turn are based on this famous paper from the 90s that I can never remember what it's called, The Dynamo and the Computer, or The Computer and the Dynamo, but it makes this very interesting observation that is grounded in the reality that often you'll have a capability and it'll take a long time before it, quote, shows up in the productivity statistics, end quote. And the reason for this, so the authors argue, has been the role of what they call like complementary intangibles historically. So saying it's not just about the thing itself, it's also about the fact that usually, much like, for instance, AI doesn't neatly slot into the taxonomy of like government things, it also doesn't neatly slot into the taxonomy of well-formed work, tasks, and processes that we use at the moment. And as a result, you have to redesign the whole sort of physical and human infrastructure within which things get done. And so the classic example here that's kind of the most interpretable is around electrification, where in order to make the most of electrical power, it wasn't just a question of swapping that in for a pre-existing component, but you actually ended up totally redesigning factories. And most of the gains came from the fact, for instance, that like you could now modularize production. So you didn't have to shut everything down when one thing broke. You could build them flat. You could have skylights because you didn't have all this equipment on the ceilings. And that reduced the rates of accidents and so on. And but all of that requires experimentation and capital expenditure. And so it can often take many decades between the invention of the thing itself, whether that's the steam engine or the dynamo or personal computing, and the sort of like rise in productivity that results from it. Even if at the moment the thing is invented, people can in an abstract way identify the fact that, oh, like in principle, this can do all of this stuff that we find useful. And maybe that like, we right now are paid to do ourselves. But that doesn't guarantee that like we'll figure out how to integrate it in a way that is reliable and easy to use. Often, whether it's like designing an interface or like restructuring a whole workflow, that can take a long time.
Yeah. I was commenting on this on Slack the other day, and I think I added the bold prediction that I didn't think we would see big increases, that would see increases in unemployment in the next 12 months, but I didn't know after that. Or was it like that's a prediction after that?
Yes.
I feel like because I do feel so at sea, or
exactly.
It's so hard to say.
I try to bound things, and I've made and lost so many bets where I've, had misplaced confidence in either how quickly or how slowly something will happen. I've been waiting for self-driving cars now for so long, so long. I don't have a driver's license. And at first this was this wasn't a principled thing. It was just, I never got around to it. Yeah. And then it became this principled thing where I said, I'm waiting for self-driving cars. And I felt so smug about it in the late 2010s, because when I began saying it, people were like, that's crazy. Yeah. And then there was this period of peak hype from 2015 to 2018, where everyone's like, oh yeah, I think you were right about the self-driving. And now I look like an idiot again. And so anyway, one of the many things I've been wrong about the rate at which technology will progress.
Yeah.
And of course, that highlights another thing, which is things might be technically capable, but it still takes a long time for us to trust them. So even in the self-driving car case, even if you had something tomorrow that you could show across a representative range of environments had a lower fatality rate than a human driver, most people would not be comfortable with it until that was reduced by an order of magnitude or something like that.
Right.
So that's another factor as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel I've always been very bullish on the idea that the march of technology, if it continues, will ultimately result in humans not being able to do useful work, because we'll invent a cheaper, more reliable way of performing every task that we would like to be performed. And so in the very long run, I think I have reasonable confidence about what the outcome would be. And some people do disagree with that long-term outcome, but I think they're just wrong on the merits of it. I think if we just continued with the rate of technological progress that we have now forever, then there's just no way that in 1 million AD, humans would still, in their current form, would still be doing anything very much in the economy.
Or you have some Baumol effect thing where people get paid just a totally preposterous amount of money to do something that you 100% care about it just because it's being done by a human, right? The classic Baumol effect example, I think, is the string quartet, where it's a string quartet is very expensive relative to, in a relative sense, what things looked like 200 years ago, because everything else has gotten cheaper. And so the opportunity cost people's time is way higher. And so maybe we'll have things where we just feel good about the fact that human is doing that. And so we'll pay them, $1 billion because everything else is free and produced by AI.
Yeah. I think I'm skeptical of that one as well in the very long run, but that's a trickier argument. But anyway, having that confidence about the long run outcome, or having this belief about the long run outcome, says nothing about what's going to happen in 2024 or 2025, really, because it could just turn out that in most of the industries where this stuff can get rolled out in the short term, the complementarities outweigh the substitutability. Exactly. And so, in fact, maybe you just get an expansion of the amount of output, or maybe the cost goes down, people buy more of it, and then just more people go into it's completely imaginable.
Totally. I think so many of these things, it gets so thorny because so many of these phenomena are interdependent, and you can be right about 99% of those relationships, and if you get one thing sequentially wrong, your predictions may end up being 100% incorrect because of exactly that kind of phenomenon, where these things are tethered in ways that are just really, really difficult to predict.
Yeah. I'll be very curious to see. I suppose the groups that have seemed like they're most on the chopping block in the near term was potentially journalists doing low quality reporting or stuff that doesn't require on the ground.
Synthesis of readily available
stuff that's on the internet, online, basically. Yeah. Then there was artists or people doing stuff that can now be produced by Midjourney. Although it wouldn't shock me there. You could imagine people might just consume an awful lot more imagery than they did before, because it's now costs 100th as much, and you just have lots of experts producing tons of images on Midjourney and being extremely good at doing that.
I think also art is an interesting one from a historical perspective, and I've always been fascinated by this because my mother is an art historian, and the sums of money that people will pay for the original of something compared to a visually indiscernible copy is sometimes hundreds of orders of that. Sorry, not hundreds of orders of magnitude. That would be impossible. Many orders of magnitude. Right, where someone will pay $500 million for a painting, where an exact replica they would pay $5,000 for. And so art, I'm sure that for many types of image production, what you've described will happen, but I suspect that I would not be surprised if in some ways the art market is quite resilient.
Yeah. Another group was a kind of low-skilled legal work, so legal adjuncts or legal assistants. But even there, it wouldn't shock me if they're not replaced anytime soon. I suppose if there's any one group that I trust to stop the march of AI in their industry, I think it's lawyers.
Exactly. There is some amount of sort of capture here, right? Where it's not just about what is technically feasible, but sort of how much sway do different groups have with legislators. Lawyers have quite a lot.
Yeah. I suppose that there's coders as well, because it seems like software engineering, maybe a lot of that stuff can be automated now, but it also wouldn't shock me if we decide to make a lot more software and a lot more bespoke software than we did before.
A whole bunch of no code generation, right? Where anytime you want to do something that previously you would take 2 hours to do yourself, now you can, without writing a single line, like spin up an app that does it for you, like courtesy of an alpha code type system.
Exactly, because we've been living in a world where we just assume that like writing code in order to accomplish a task faster is just never going to be sensible unless you're doing it at a big scale. Whereas like now it could be the reverse. I guess I'll be very interested to see the labor statistics on that over the next 24 months. An audience member sent in this question for you, which asking, do you think that AI policy is going to become a partisan political issue in the US and I guess potentially also the UK? I feel my gut intuition says yes, because everything gets polarized. But the interesting thing is I have no idea in which direction, because it's so cross-cutting, which speaks to the absurdity of the idea of it becoming polarized. But what do you reckon?
I would love to say no, because sort of from a intrinsically, there is no reason why it seems like it should be. Unfortunately, the historical track record is, who would have thought that vaccines would become a partisan issue, but they did in the US at least. There is maybe one reason, somewhat depressing reason, actually, to think that it won't, which is that one of the only issues that enjoys bipartisan consensus in the US at the moment is anything involving competition with China. And so to the extent that people see this stuff as being a way to win, I would expect that to be motivating. And again, maybe there is a way to sort of spin things that we wouldn't necessarily at first blush think of as adversarial, as being a competition in a positive way, right? Like you were saying earlier, like how can we win the safety race or something like that? So yeah, that would be one reason to think that it will not become partisan.
Yeah. I've heard that many issues that are kind of presented in a partisan way in the media and by politicians on social media, behind the scenes in Congress, there's a lot of very normal negotiations about them, and actually a surprising amount of stuff gets done, and that a lot of the partisan stuff is just for the cameras, basically. Is that right?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, I actually know almost nothing outside of news coverage about Congress. I didn't really know what to expect when I took this White House job, like how much we'd work with the legislature. And there are definitely some teams, like legislative affairs teams and so on at the White House that do work quite closely with Congress. But I didn't do any congressional briefings. I don't really have any insight into what things look like. One issue area, though, that is interesting through this light is high school immigration, where my sense is that high school immigration itself is an area where there is bipartisan consensus. But the problem is that both sides, because they know the other side also wants it, try to use it as a bargaining chip to get what they want at the other end of the immigration spectrum in particular, right? So people on the left say we'll approve high-skill immigration reform if we also let in more asylum seekers. And people on the right say, we'll approve it if you build the wall or something like that. So yeah.
Right, yeah. My guess is AI policy won't become partisan in the UK, just because many things are not partisan here.
Exactly.
That might otherwise be.
The US is, I think, unusually polarized.
How much time have you spent working on, it sounds like you've engaged a bunch with political philosophy, maybe more than I imagine most nuts and bolts policymakers have. Are you taking a very kind of academic political philosophy approach to all of this, or is it more practical?
I would say definitely in terms of like what my day-to-day was like when I was at OSTP, it was not deeply philosophical. It was sort of like very operational. The stuff that I've been thinking about since then, I think has been a bit more abstract. And in particular, I've really enjoyed working with this new center at Harvard, the Getting Plurality Center, which is led by Danielle Allen, who's a political philosopher who's done a bunch of very, very cool work. I think sort of coming back to these questions around how can we pair increased state capacity with sort of the use of technology to strengthen sort of popular sovereignty over decision-making, I think that this raises a series of philosophical questions, some of which are as old as time, but maybe it contextualizes them in a new way. And sort of in a nutshell, the way I think about this is the design space is now much, much, much broader, conceivably. The types of institutions that we could build vary much more widely than the possibilities available to people in, let's say, the late 1700s. And that, in some ways, removes a lot of constraints. That removal of those constraints mean that we have to make, in a more conscious and deliberate way, decisions that we didn't have to face before. And some of these get to like the core of some like major issues in political philosophy. So just to list a few. One would be, what is the relationship between interpretability and performance? There's this whole interesting and emerging space of research that says, if we take like an information theoretic approach to thinking about governance systems, ballots are incredibly lossy and compressive, right? I mean, you get like 1 or 2 bits of information, basically, depending on how many choices you have on it. What if instead you could just articulate all of your political hopes and dreams to a system that could engage with you in natural language, help you paint these pictures of what life would look like if policy A was passed versus policy B, help you kind of like ground this in the things that you actually really understand deeply and care about. In some ways, this sounds great because it means that we can sort of have our cake and eat it too. We can often, I think of machine learning as being scalable nuance. We can take things that previously you could only do in a local way, right? In a community of 10 people, you can like really hash things out. But as we sort of build society up, we've historically had to accept way lossier sort of regimes for aggregating information. And with ML, maybe you can have scale and nuance. Everyone can engage with this system, and that can like really extract your preferences in a super fine-grained way. And then you can apply over that, the sort of social choice function of your choosing, or social welfare function. So you can say, we want something that's like maxi-min, or maximizes average utility or something. Even if you manage to avoid all of the predictable technical pitfalls here, right? What if these systems end up not being aligned? What if they end up being racist? Or what if they end up sort of like actually optimizing for the inverse of what you told them to because you made some error in the code? Even if it works perfectly, we face this question of like, how much do we care about the interpretability of the system versus the performance that it instantiates? And on the interpretability side, ballots like incredibly straightforward. Like everyone can kind of understand the idea of the person or the policy wins that like has the most X's next to it. And even something like ranked choice voting, which is in the scheme of things like relatively interpretable, can understandably like throw people for a loop. If we had a blank slate and we were going to Mars, would we want something where you can just talk to it? In some ways, you could end up in equilibria that utility wise or according to whatever the function of your choosing are way better. On the other hand, if people deny election results now, like, of course, it's way easier for them to say, the system like didn't listen to me.
Well, who makes the system? Or who makes
the system and who validates it, right?
Right. Because couldn't someone just switch it with a machine that listens to you at great length and talks at great length and then just always spits out outcome X, no matter what has happened? And how would you know?
And this is, in some ways, of course, this is exactly what a lot of the conspiracy theories around the 2020 election said, right? Which was, like in this abstract way, we understand what the mechanism is of adding up votes. But how do we know that what was in this Dominion voting machine, was actually doing that?
Right.
And so, people
that actually is a good reason not to have electronic voting machines even.
Yes.
I didn't necessarily trust them completely.
Sure. And Bruce Schneier has done a bunch of good sort of writing on like the reasons like not to trust electronic voting. So again, I'm kind of like assuming away all of these technical implementation things here. And so I'm sure that like any cybersecurity researcher who's listening to this is like tearing their hair out. But I mean, even with manual counting, right? You can say, well, we don't know what happens in the room once we give all these things, to these people. Maybe the room of counters has been captured by special interests in some way. Maybe they burned a bunch of ballots, et cetera, et cetera. At some level, we'll always have this, but this is certainly more extreme the less interpretable a system is. And on the one hand, there's reason to be pessimistic because look at how much doubt is already cast on these things. On the other hand, there's reason to be optimistic because in all kinds of other domains, we use things that we really have no idea how they work. Almost all of us have no idea how they work all the time, and we don't really question it. We get on planes and we buy stuff where the supply chains are like obscenely complicated, and we mostly trust social systems and legal systems that we have. No one's read like the entire body of law, and so on and so forth. And so there are all kinds of questions. Like, what would it mean to like trust a system like this, and so on. Yeah, maybe I'll give like one or two other of these because I think there are like loads that are interesting. But like one would be there's this big question in political philosophy to a great extent. Existing legal regimes implicitly end up honoring the wishes of the dead rather than the living because the body of law is huge and the throughput of a legislature is way too narrow to
reconsider things
given the scope that we want the state to have. And so historically, you've had this sort of trade-off where either you can have a state with a remit that is representative of what people wanted to cover, and you have to rely on like really old stuff. Or you can have sort of some kind of like minarchy where the state only has 3 laws, and those 3 laws get repassed every year. And at various times there have been like almost joking proposals, but some that are serious to like have laws expire. But again, the problem is that then you run into this kind of throughput problem. So now let's say instead that like we have these magical AI systems that can take all of our preferences and are tracking who's alive and who's dead and who's moved somewhere, and that regularly update all of these clauses, right? So it's exactly representative of like the current citizenry, which raises all kinds of other questions about like, who actually gets to vote. For instance, now do children get to vote because they can communicate with this AI system and they don't really need to know that much about policy? Or do we think it's like still a rite of passage that it's only once you come 18 and so on? Non-citizens, and I mean, there's all kinds of ways that AI could broaden this stuff in general, animals, inanimate objects, future generations, so on. But like, one of many questions this raises is, like, would we, if we could now, would we want this to be only representative of people who are breathing right now, for instance? Or do we actually think that, people have historically made arguments in favor of honoring the wishes of the dead for all kinds of reasons that don't have to do with these practical considerations? But we've never really had to seriously take this into account because it wasn't actually feasible to build something that could do this. So now as the design space expands, it's kind of like everything has to become deliberate, and that might force upon us all kinds of questions about what equality means, what representation means, in ways that we haven't had to confront before.
Yeah, I don't normally think about things just into. There's one view on politics, which is very focused on power and who has control and who's managing to get their way over others.
Yes.
And I guess normally I'm somewhat more on the side of thinking that the main problem isn't people being selfish or some people having power over others. It's that we don't know how to fix the problems that we have. Although, of course, both of these are issues. But talking about just building a machine that will talk to people and then spit out an answer of what the law should be, definitely alarms are going off in my head saying it's not just a technical problem.
Completely, yeah. So, and I think a lot of this is exactly why I find this stuff interesting. Is that of course, my inner techno-optimist wants to say, yes, of course, we can reduce democracy to this very elegant information theoretic framing, and now you can have a less compressive system. And then my inner pragmatist who's seen things in the world and been immensely frustrated, especially in terms of bridging the sort of policy and technical spaces by people who take the software engineer mindset to all of these complex, knotty social problems, right?
Can be quite cringe.
My inner pragmatist, and sort of student of the humanities wants to say, oh my God, that's horrific. You're missing all of these things. And so the work that I was planning on doing this coming year was trying to reconcile exactly those two camps of things, which is to say, if we start with this premise, there are some things that we could all agree would be very, very bad, where you get autocratic lock-in. There are some ways that maybe we can create new methods through which we could instill some democratic virtues. But instead of just optimizing for that blindly, right, there are all kinds of historical pitfalls where techno-optimists have said, this is great because, it makes information sharing easier. And how could that be bad? And then it turns out that, the world is more complicated. So the thing that I'm really interested in is how can we take a look at these technical considerations and these sort of philosophical considerations, as well as practical social science and historical observations, and say, if you did remove these constraints, would it be good? If you could in some way optimize for this idea of we can capture people's preferences more fully, is that actually what we want? Almost certainly not. Almost certainly that is a reductive and inaccurate depiction of democracy. But if we have that tool available, do we want to use it not at all? Or do we want to use it a bit and maybe do some experimentation and maybe supplement it with other things? There's a lot of interesting stuff here from sort of aesthetics, right? You look at beautiful buildings where there's an old building with a new addition, right? Like the British Museum, right? Or the Reichstag or something like that. Maybe there's something like that we want to realize in terms of our approach to institutions, where there are some things that function the way that they've always functioned because tradition is a good way to avoid having things completely collapse, but there are some new tools that we want to sort of introduce. And so there's a thicket of really messy issues and ways that things could go wrong. And the good news is that historically there's loads of great political philosophy work that has sort of unpacked these, but there are now new questions around how do we apply that in light of new and emerging technical capabilities. That's sort of the space of things that I find most interesting.
Let's push on to talk a little bit about your own career history and what advice you might have to people, listeners who want to go out there and try to do something useful in this general area. What's something cool that you did while you were at DeepMind?
So I had a real adventure when I was at DeepMind because I actually showed up having almost no knowledge of sort of anything about AI, and I cycled through a number of different roles when I was there, and by the time I left, I was sort of very in the weeds because I took this research science position, and so there were loads of things that I enjoyed working on. One in particular was my final stint at DeepMind. I was the research lead for this team, Meta Research, that thought about how can we use machine learning, among other tools, to generate insights that help guide managerial and strategic decision-making. So a lot of that was doing research using bibliometric data and metadata to try to get a sense of what are the the subdomains of machine learning research that are rising and falling in importance? What are things that could be especially well suited to DeepMind writ large or to specific individuals and teams within DeepMind? What are specific geographies where more talent seems to be being graduating from universities? Which conferences seem to be producing stuff that's in line with our interests, and so on? How do capabilities stack up across countries and across different labs? And then there was also this kind of internal managerial facing component, which was how can we improve the sort of matching of people with one another and with projects, because once a lab exceeds 1,000 people, that's very difficult to do in this sort of like high dimensional intuitive way that you can when you have a few dozen people. And so especially in an area like AI where a huge number of papers are pushed to archive every week, way too many to navigate, tools like this can be very helpful. So, for instance, one person on the team, Adam Lishka, who's now running a very cool startup called Glyphic, created this tool, the paper recommender, that essentially used data from an internal project management system so that you could kind of get a really good, fine-grained, up-to-date sense of what areas people were working on and interested in, and then essentially sort of converted that to this like embedding space and used that to like find nearest neighbors based on recently released archive papers to say which of these papers are relevant to specific people and specific projects. It was also really helpful for like suggesting which workshops people should go to at conferences and so on. We had a lunch recommender tool that like suggested people that like you hadn't yet worked with whose interests were sort of like suitably close to yours, that a conversation might produce new insights. So we were interested in a lot of questions around how can you frame the function of organizations, which is also something I sort of worked on in a previous life before I began doing AI stuff. How can you frame those things as machine learning problems? And it turns out a lot of them are like very, very, very well suited to things that at this point are totally commoditized machine learning capabilities. So like recommendation engines and so on. That was something I especially enjoyed.
Yeah. Did it work? I guess. I suppose. Intuitively, it sounds like a case where you might bring some very advanced technology to a problem and then find that it just doesn't super help in trying to organize your work exactly.
The paper recommender got very, very good reviews. Well, okay, I should step back. Obviously, as with any sort of like, as with deploying anything in the wild, it's impossible to truly know the counterfactual. And unlike deploying a product that gets used by millions of people, of course, we're not going to be able to do A/B testing at the scale that would be required to say in an ironclad way, 100%, this improved efficiency by 6% or something like that. The paper recommender and the sort of conference recommender tool, people found very useful because this problem of the information overload of stuff out there was very visceral, and anyone who's in the AI research space will be familiar with this. So that both like anecdotally, people said very positive things, and just like the sort of click-through rate of people subsequently reading the papers that were surfaced to them in this interface was very, very high. The lunch pairing tool was something where it's so hard to measure this stuff because research is such a sort of contingent activity. And so, and this was also a program that we ran for a while, but then COVID happened. And so like we took it down and so that was a tricky one to measure. Anecdotally, people said that they had a great time, but maybe that's just because people like having lunch with each other. So difficult to say.
You mentioned potentially using AI systems to help with task allocation. So you're saying as an organization gets very big that a manager who has some project idea doesn't necessarily know who in the organization is best positioned to do the thing. And I suppose, when you're a team of 3, then you really know all of your colleagues extremely well, and you have a great sense of who's available and who would do the best job out of the 3 of you. But once you're a team of 1,000, not so much. Yeah, what's the vision for how that would work in practice? Is this kind of, I suppose maybe I'm really stuck in the MML mindset, but I'm imagining what an MML that reads every doc that anyone in the organization produces and everything that they write on Slack and everything in their email and builds a model of each person and their interests,
right,
and their availability and so on, possibly even of who they would work best with. And then, you write in your thing of here's the project brief. Who do you think in the organization should do it? It might be able to spit it back. Is that kind of the vision for how this would work?
So there are lots of different ways that something like this could manifest, and some would be like totally hellish and sort of like bring all of the dehumanization that I think we've seen in a lot of the gig economy stuff. And some of it would be like really wonderful and you could avoid like the bureaucracy that people often find really oppressive. So if we think at the highest level, like a lot of what organizations are doing is indeed like matching people with projects, information, resourcing, and one another. And in any small group, we tend to think that's done pretty well from a sort of precision and recall perspective. As groups grow bigger, precision and recall really drop off. So even organizations that we think of as being incredibly effective, if you talk to people, they'll say, I spend a ton of time reading things and going to meetings and so on that are irrelevant to me. And also, I feel like often I've missed the memo on things that I would like to be doing and that would be relevant to me. So clearly, like, we're very far away from like optimal matching. Because now a lot of stuff is tracked, let's say project management tools, right, can get often quite a deep sense of the work that you're doing. There are loads of ways that one could imagine improving that sort of like matching accuracy. And to give a couple of specific examples, obviously this depends on like the space in which one is working. But in research, and especially in tech companies, a lot of your work involves writing code. And then there's this whole code review process. So who is best suited to review your code or debug a specific problem that you've come across or help you spitball new ideas for something? Like, that's exactly the kind of thing that you could represent pretty adequately with the kinds of tools that have been used all over the place in everything from, like Spotify recommendations to dating apps and stuff like that. There are all kinds of sort of ways that this can go wrong and risks that people run into if they take, I think, too naive an approach to matching. So, for instance, it's not always the case that like the best match is the closest match. If you think about like what's the best paper for you to read, there's probably something that's too close because it's almost synonymous with something that you yourself has produced. And then there's something that's so far away that it won't make any sense. And then there's some Goldilocks zone in this high dimensional semantic space within which you will be pushed and inspired, but you'll also kind of understand what's going on. Likewise with collaborators and so on, I think oftentimes, as we've learned from, for instance, information bubbles and like YouTube, like weird YouTube playlists and stuff like that, if these things are just maximizing for click-through rate, you can end up getting sucked down like a really unproductive and unfulfilling sort of like a rabbit hole. But you can imagine that if you represented this stuff sufficiently richly, and if you thought really hard about like what are the metrics for which you actually want to optimize, and if you had a number of points at which users could like provide feedback about sort of like how productive they were, how satisfied they felt, and so on, in addition to looking at more objective standards like how many lines of code are you writing, how well does your code run, etc., what are your performance reviews like? That's the kind of thing that you can imagine could inform. Let me put it this way. I would be shocked if in like 2035, we look at how organizations are functioning and the most successful organizations look anything like they do today. Because I think the tooling we'll have available will just radically expand the space of possibilities. And surely there are some subsets of that space that are just like net better. There are lots of pitfalls along the way. And there are lots of ways that this stuff could be dystopian. If it's done carefully, I think it could be great.
Yeah. What's the hell vision of this?
You yeah. So
I guess it's just like everyone is the AI's bitch now. And, it's just like, go do this random task for 5 minutes. And then
the hell vision is some combination of like the dehumanization of Taylorism combined with sort of like losing track of, losing any sense of solidarity because you're working with a different person every day. And again, we've seen a lot of this in sort of the gig. You could have made, to critique the argument I just made, someone could have made painted a similarly rosy picture of gig work 10 or 15 years ago, saying, at the moment, you have this kind of like really slow bureaucracy that like assigns people to things and it's inefficient and you're sort of all of this middle management function isn't accomplishing that much. Wouldn't it be great if you had the flexibility of being able to say, I'm going to drive people, deliver things, order things, get a ride, etc., like whenever I want, and you can set your rates and so on. And in some ways, of course, that did like facilitate new forms of flexibility. But it also has had like all kinds of like second and third order consequences that have been quite harmful for the people involved, especially on the sort of like supplying side. And so that manifests like, I think, what some of these problems could look like.
Yeah. I mean, in principle, it seems like if the firm had the right incentives, if they were motivated to be concerned about the well-being of staff and how much they enjoyed the work or how fulfilling they found the work, if only because they're worried about staff retention, then it seems like this stuff should be quite straightforward to include in the model. So you would learn that if you just place someone with a completely new person, then you tend to get much worse feedback from them afterwards and how good that matching was.
Yes.
Yeah, but the question is like, do the incentives exist?
Exactly. So like in principle, yes. The problem is, of course, some things are more easily measured than others. And I think this is responsible for like a lot of the problems we've seen historically with recommender systems is that it's easy to... So like one of the terms actually that I learned from this colleague of mine who's a super forecaster is like the rigor relevance trade-off, right? Like some things, and this is like essentially just like a restatement of a big piece of the alignment problem, which is like often the things that you actually care about are really hard to measure. And there are things that are easy to measure that are like, okay, proxies, but Goodhart's law comes into effect pretty quickly. And so if you optimize just for that, you end up in like a really weird place. And so organizationally, something like how many trips is someone running or how many lines of code are they writing is really easily measured. Something like their overall social satisfaction and how that's going to make them feel after they've been there for 18 months can be much harder to measure. But in principle, yes, like one should, in a limit, be able to capture all of these things. But as you note, the second big risk, in addition to like the sort of technical challenges of measuring this stuff, is do the incentives actually exist? There are some cases where, unfortunately, it will be in the firm's interest not to have people be happy because it's unemployment is high, and you can exactly you can just hire someone else, and maybe this is an industry where the sort of interpersonal and tacit knowledge don't matter a ton, and so you do just want to keep getting warm bodies in there. Yeah, exactly. And so there are all kinds of areas where the incentives don't necessarily align, but in the cases where they do, I think that there are ways that ML can sort of expand the space of solutions to things that are net positive.
What did you work on CSET? I guess you mentioned something. So this is the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Actually, maybe a broader question. Is there anything that CSET has done in the last few years that you've been impressed by or think that people should go check out?
Yeah, so I mean, disclaimer that I'm biased because I had some affiliation, but I think CSET has done a huge amount of really, really excellent research. And I would point to, there are too many papers to list, but I'll point to a few categories of work. The first is that the CSET data team has done a lot of amazing stuff, pulling together a whole bunch of largely bibliometric data sets that had previously not been unified, and looking at the relationship between, for instance, papers and patents in different countries, in different regions, the relationship between universities and AI labs, all kinds of things that this data is very naturally well suited to, because anything in the bibliometric space has two great things going for it. One, you have a lot of rich unstructured data, which is to say you have the text of the abstracts and sometimes the full papers that enables you to get a sense of in topic space, what is this stuff? Secondly, you have this nice graphical structure because you have these consistent entities, which is to say institutions and people, as well as journals and conferences and so on, that enable you to have sort of nodes and edges and say who knows whom, who's worked with whom, and so on. That gives you sort of two powerful and different ways of relating things in these sort of topic or social spaces. And I think that this is similar to some of the stuff I worked on DeepMind. I think that the CSET data team has done a really good job of integrating a lot of messy data sets that together can generate a whole bunch of insights. And so almost everything that they've produced I found to be very useful. A second category is they have done a lot of research that is fundamentally qualitative, but is informed by deep subject matter expertise on emerging tech issues, which thankfully is becoming more common in DC, but a few years ago was actually quite rare, especially if it's an area that wasn't a technology of traditional government interest. So you'd be able to find loads of stuff on nuclear capabilities and missiles and so on. But most of the sort of think tank output on AI was not grounded in let's say, a really deep understanding of the semiconductor supply chain. CSET did a bunch of great work on that supply chain in particular, as well as looking at other choke points relevant to competition between countries.
Yeah. Well, what are some useful roles that people might be able to take in DC or London, if you know about London, that might not be immediately obvious?
I think in general, there is a real dearth of people who have technical AI expertise and or deep familiarity at kind of the social level with the AI space, who are interested in doing policy work. And that's completely understandable for a whole host of reasons. But I would say if you have one or both of those bodies of knowledge, there is a ton of value that you can add, given how thin the bench is at the moment within government and the policy community more broadly. And I should say this may be especially acute in the United States, partially for geographic reasons, which is that in the US, the center of the tech community and the center of the government community are thousands of miles apart. In London, conveniently, they're a tube ride apart.
And maybe also socially disconnected in some way.
Exactly.
And maybe politically disconnected a little bit
as well.
And
I think that all of those things are closely related. I think that in terms of this idea that these different communities speak different languages, I think that is more extreme in the US, largely because you have these subcultures that have evolved to become, in their local environment, kind of all-consuming, right? DC is so heavily policy focused, and SF is so heavily tech focused, or the Bay Area writ large. And as a result, I think that has some benefits. You get the benefits of specialization, and you have these funky subcultures that can do things they maybe could only do in isolation. But it also has the major drawback of increasing the barrier to coordination. So I think this is relevant sort of all over the place, but in the US, it is, I think, especially severe.
Yeah, I suppose by comparison in the UK, I mean, there's some people who go into politics and some people who go into more technical stuff, but they probably all went to Cambridge at some point. So,
yeah, exactly.
It is actually alarming how inbred I think some of the elite is in the UK. It has a lot of downsides.
It's astounding. It's 20 prime ministers have gone to Eton or something like that. I mean, just absolutely shocking. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one doesn't have to worry about elitism too much to think that in the UK it's maybe a little bit extreme.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Are there any factors that help to determine, or any factors that people might not be super salient to people that help to determine how much influence they have in a policy role?
Yeah. So one thing is, I think that government, maybe somewhat surprisingly for listeners who are familiar with James C. Scott's work, where he talks about legibility and how important legibility historically has been to governments. Governments themselves are remarkably illegible as institutions coming into from the outside. This is a way bigger problem, I think, in government than it has been in my experience of industry, and my experience of industry has been limited to the tech world. So when I began working at Google, there was a huge supply of explainer materials and code notebooks and videos and decks and docs that explained how everything worked, from sort of physical infrastructure to what teams were responsible for and so on. Obviously, there's still some level of tacit knowledge that isn't accessible, but you can onboard yourself pretty effectively. Within government, so much of that knowledge is held within people's brains, and that is partially just because it's a more old school place and it's not as online forward. And so the idea of documenting something and putting it on a blog is just sort of less intuitive. Also, I think it's because in some sense, information is power. And if you know, quote, how the building works, unquote, that's something that you can wield to your advantage. And DC, to some extent, is a place that cares about that. I mean, I should say, in general, I found the White House to be way less House of Cardsy than I think. I was worried about going into it, but I do think it's the case that a remarkably high share of information gets downloaded in one-on-one coffee chats where you need to have had the right intro beforehand. And a lot of the seemingly observable external structure where you can look at an org chart and say, oh, this division has this name, thus it's responsible for issues X and Y, is not representative of the underlying reality. So you have some groups that sound totally random and boring and are incredibly powerful, and vice versa. So the first thing I'd say is really take that in stride. And it's an annoying thing to say, but the networking does matter in this space, and sort of invest in trying to get interpersonal downloads of information. And I would say, in terms of work that people can do that's valuable, someone writing a really well-written, the equivalent of, there are so many great explainer blog posts out there on all kinds of topics, especially in the ML space. I leaned on those hugely when I was learning ML. Someone who brings that energy to documenting how to get things done in DC would be invaluable. It's not that no one has written things like that, but there are just way fewer of them. And something like that, especially something that is optimized for people who are trying to make this leap from the tech world to the policy world, that would be really, really, really helpful.
Do you think some of that might be explained by the adversarial relationship that the government has with, I suppose, some groups that they're trying to regulate, for instance, or maybe journalists as well tend to be pretty harsh on government sometimes. So there's an inclination to just hold as much information close to your chest as you can as a defensive maneuver? So
absolutely, there are some things that it makes sense to keep close hold, but that doesn't need to include how to use the office printer, even things like that. It was in order to figure this out, well, this person will have to explain it to you, or someone else will dig up a PDF that someone emailed to them 5 years ago that's now 50% out of date, but is just in general, the level of documentation is stuck in another era. Some of that, a small proportion of it, I think, is defensible, or at least, let's say, explicable on the basis of, you want to reduce information leakage. But I think a lot of it is just the result of some combination of old institutions, not an especially sort of tech-forward mindset, and sort of parochial concerns about wanting to use information in a way that empowers you.
Yeah. I know of a gym in an office building where not this one, but a different one that will remain anonymous, where in order to use it, you have to get a safety briefing on how to use the gym.
Yes, right. So this is exactly
which only happens every 6 months.
Exactly. This is exactly the sort of thing where someone will say, oh yeah, if you want to figure out how to, again, something as simple as file this form, you have to talk to Jim, and you can only catch Jim at 10:30, when he gets his sandwich
on a full moon,
on a full moon, and like he knows how things work in the northwest corner of the building, but if you're in the southeast corner of the building, then he doesn't know anything. Like then you have to talk to Miranda because
that's Miranda territory.
So it's like incredible, like how tacit and parochial a lot of this knowledge is, and I think that is often like a big impediment to some forms of efficiency. Again, in some cases it makes sense. Like I understand lots of things. Like for stuff that's actually classified, I get it. Like at least in principle, there are other debates about over and under classification and so on. But like some of this stuff, absolutely, I see the argument for keeping a close hold. But a lot of it is something that like there is a better way. Yeah.
Imagine the recursive self-improvement loop that might be set off if bureaucrats accessed printer technology.
I mean, this is the kind of thing I think about going to sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, what are some other important cultural differences between the tech scene and government for people who are moving between them?
I would say one that surprised me is like, I think the tenure that people have in government is more bimodal than in industry. So you will have people who are lifers, like civil servants who joined, let's say, the State Department, like right out of university and stay there until they retire. But for most roles at the White House, for instance, the typical tenure is 12 to 24 months. This is the result of sort of a whole bunch of things, including electoral time cycles and so on. And it's just a much, much higher rate of churn than, for instance, like at DeepMind, people stay there for forever. And I was there for, 5.5 years. And that, I don't know if that was average, but it definitely wasn't like way, way, way above average. Whereas in government, I was there for 12 months. And by the time I left, a significant proportion of the people who were around when I arrived had left. Often that's because they're cycling out to a different piece of government. So you'll have someone who, for instance, like works at a department or agency and then gets detailed to the White House for a fixed length term and then goes back. But the churn, especially when you combine it with this sort of information flow problem.
It seems like this is going to produce extremely odd dynamics where you have people who are there permanently and people who are visiting for 12 months, more or less. Because I guess this reminds me of the Yes Minister stuff where if you're a lifer, then you just got to wait them out 12 months.
Exactly.
And if they don't manage to get it done by then hopefully the next person doesn't want to do it.
And it results in like a whole bunch of, you can imagine like all the miscommunication that happens as a result of something like this. So I guess one other thing is depending on the type of policy work one wants to do, if you want to do anything that is classified or just like related to national security, having a security clearance really does make a difference. Not so much because it's not like a ton of decisions need classified information in order to be made, but it's because almost all of the most senior decision makers, of course, have security clearances. They want to be as well informed as possible. And as a result, the meetings and briefing documents and so on that are the closest to those decisions will often, whether necessarily or not, end up incorporating the classified reporting on the topic at hand. And that means that, if you want to be in the room where it happens, so to speak, it really, really helps. And so to the extent that one can get a job that includes sort of conferring a clearance as part of it, that's a real help, because then that means that you can take subsequent roles that require a clearance without having to go through that whole process. And that's very appealing to the employer.
Yeah. You grew up not in the United States, or you
Correct.
spent an enormous amount of your life not inside the United States.
Yes.
I would have thought that could potentially be a big impediment. Wouldn't you potentially have to report having the conversation with me because I'm an Australian and I might be trying to turn you into a double agent or something like that? Yeah.
Yes. So it's complicated, but the short version is yes. If you have, it is slightly difficult to get a clearance if you have foreign ties, and so you have to fill out a form that lists all of your foreign contacts. There's a lot of fuzziness around what exactly counts as a contact, how much interaction you have to have had with someone. This is an area where it is definitely worth it to pay a lawyer for 1 hour to get their advice on this.
Okay.
For anyone who's going through this process.
Soul really scrolling back over a very large Tinder profile.
Exactly. Like there are many ways of overcounting, which will create needless work, and there are many ways of undercounting, which will violate the law. And so, speaking to a lawyer is very worthwhile in this space. And then you also have to list all of your foreign travel, and then you will go through an interview process where there are people who look into all of this stuff and then ask you questions about it. It's not clear to me what happens, kind of like behind the veil. Like it's a total black box when you go through the process. Like I don't know exactly what criteria they're applying to things. So it's possible that it's all like very enlightened and rigorous. But yes, just based on sort of stories I've heard, I am somewhat worried that a lot of it is a formality that maybe, in keeping one of the themes of this conversation, isn't totally aligned with the stuff that actually matters, but is something that has been like filtered down many times where
highly procedural maybe, or
it's very procedural, and there may also be like a false negatives, false positives sort of like imbalance, which is that like if you approve one person who ends up being a security risk, that probably looks really, really, really bad. Whereas if
throwing
you don't
enormous
approve,
amounts of talent.
exactly, like 50 people who have state-of-the-art knowledge of Chinese politics, for instance, then
never gets pinned on you.
Exactly, it never gets pinned on you. So I don't know. I haven't seen what these processes look on the other side, but like I can imagine that pathologies like that might exist.
In the interview with Ezra, he was a bit dismayed by how many people who wanted to help with AI safety have gone into the labs rather than going into government or moving to DC. He thought that there was a real bias towards doing that, because I guess maybe because people found it more interesting or people found it cooler. Reflecting on that, I mean, the first episode we ever did on this show was about AI policy, desperately trying to redirect people basically into DC. So I basically agree with this. But I also worry that many people who would have flourished in some of these labs would have crashed and burned if they'd moved to DC. And I wonder whether there was also a kind of sensible degree of prudence maybe and self-preservation among people who sensed that they were not a good fit for going and working in policy. And perhaps just the fundamental, like, in addition to the issue that people may be inclined to just do the thing that the people they know are doing. That's the path of least resistance. There's also just a problem that the people who know the most about this technically often just aren't a very good fit, either personality-wise or in terms of the skills that they develop for going and actually having any success in policy circles. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. I think that like the disposition required for roles in industry and government is really different, and the working style is really different. So yeah, maybe that's another thing I should have flagged, is like, if you're considering making this jump, talk to people who work in policy in as close to the area that you want to do as possible about just like what their day-to-day is like. And if you really value having theoretical discussions in computer science and you really hate wrangling people in bureaucracies to hold big meetings and reach consensus, and if that's what the job that you would go into in the policy space would involve, then yeah, it's probably not for you. So I think that is broadly, I think that is indeed a concern. But I think that the filtering to date has been like more extreme than is merited by that concern, if that makes sense.
As in, you think that there were a reasonable number of people who could have gone either way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. I was going to say, it feels like the phenomena that is driving DC and tech groups apart is quite fundamental and quite hard to shift, and is no one's fault in particular. That I guess you're saying that there are some people who are on the fence who could potentially do both, and it's just up to them which path they go down. But many people, it seems like temperamentally, they're already like they already know by the time they're 18 that they're a much better fit for one of these than the other, because the cultures are already quite different. The kinds of personality type that might flourish studying computer science and then going into a technical role is potentially quite different than someone who would work well as a bureaucrat or as a politician. And these places are geographically separated. People are streamed already at the age of 18 or 19, where they're probably going and studying quite different things. And then they probably don't socialize all that much because the background knowledge they have is completely different.
And it becomes self-reinforcing because, of course, like if initially you feel a little bit like Group A is your group as opposed to Group B, and then you spend 10 years only hanging out with people in Group A, it's going to get harder to talk to people in Group B, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the stereotype is that science and technology policy is an area where government really struggles, and it's often kind of on the back foot. I guess maybe looking at it that way, it's almost remarkable that things aren't worse. Things could be worse than they are.
Honestly, I'm astounded all the time that things aren't worse. Yeah, it's just across so many domains. Like when there are so many ways that things could go terribly off the rails all the time, and the fact that like the world is still spinning and we haven't had nuclear Armageddon is like sort of astounding. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who are maybe more on the technical side now, but are interested in making a transition, who feel like they could potentially succeed in DC? How should they go about? What first steps could they take?
I think that, as is often the case, maybe the best first step is to connect with someone who has a similar background to you, who's doing the types of things that you're interested in doing. And I think that for AI in particular, there is still a huge shortage of people, but the situation is less bad now than it was a few years ago. There are several institutions that I think have like taken quite an active role in bringing people with that kind of expertise to DC. So a couple that I'll list, and this isn't an exhaustive set, but CSET, as I mentioned before, I think has done a bunch of good work in this space. There's the Horizon, I think it's called the Horizon Fellowship, that is run by Remco Zwetsloot and Joan Gass. That is specifically focused on bringing in people who have mainly STEM backgrounds to like help them. And the program doesn't just pay for something, but it actually includes this whole sort of extensive orientation to familiarize people with the space of opportunities in DC, and then does matchmaking to like help situate people at, I think that they do both bits of the government itself as well as think tanks. Then there are government programs like the AAAS Fellowship and things that have explicitly sort of targeted people with science backgrounds. But yeah, so I would say, look for gateway individuals or institutions.
What about people going the other way? Do you have any advice for people who are currently maybe policy experts? And would you think that some of them should be going into working at DeepMind or OpenAI or Anthropic or another group?
Yes, I think that is good. I think in general, like more cross-pollination is better. I do think that there is a shortage of people with policy expertise at these labs. I think it's less acute than the imbalance going the other way, because these labs mostly do have like very competent, well-staffed policy teams. But I still think that like more is better. For people who are interested in doing that stuff, I think my advice would be similar, which is speak to people who are like in policy roles at these organizations now to get a sense for how different life will be. And in particular, I think something that maybe people aren't always prepared for is if you come from policy land, then you're going to be sort of used to policy considerations being paramount. And if you enter a lab, they increasingly do take policy stuff very seriously. But this is like one of many considerations. And the cultures at these places tend to be, first and foremost, quite technical and researchy. So one question is, if you're in this category, if a policy person who doesn't have a technical background, who's interested in going to a lab, like one of the first questions is, how much do you care about learning to speak like the local language, as it were, which is to say like becoming proficient with the things that matter in machine learning? That doesn't mean you have to get a PhD, but there's a big difference between being able to give a economist article level explanation of what ChatGPT is and being able to, for instance, read the abstracts of papers at NeurIPS and understand why they matter, and how significant like a given advance is. Because some stuff will be very important and some stuff will be trivial. That's like really, really useful knowledge to have. It's also like quite difficult if you're coming from like not a STEM focused background. And so one question is like there are some people who really take to that like a fish to water, and they like get to a lab and they dive in the deep end and all that stuff. There are other people who do a great job in policy roles without really like investing hugely in that. And I think that one thing that people who are considering making that transition should ask themselves is like, do they care about doing that? And if so, like, do they really care about doing it? I mean, almost everyone initially says that they like, everyone wants to like quote learn to code, like unquote, right? But like,
it's like I want to learn Japanese,
exactly,
but I'm not going to learn Japanese,
right? Like, how many times have I like started Hindi on Duolingo and like I like relearn the alphabet like every 2 years and then I forget it.
I think this is going to be another driver's license situation where you speak Hindi as soon as ChatGPT speaks Hindi. Yeah?
Thankfully, we now have good neural machine translation, even though we don't have self-driving cars. So, but yeah, so a question is like, if you're interested in this kind of role, do you want to learn this stuff? And do you really want to learn it enough to like put in a ton of work? Because that will affect both a plausible paths, but it will affect maybe the degree to which you feel at home in these places. I think it can be alienating, as it was to me when I first arrived at DeepMind and like had no idea what anyone was talking about. Like, it can be alienating to think that sort of the bread and butter of what a company does, and even just the conversations that people like have at lunch and the things that they present at meetings are all oftentimes literal Greek to you. And so, learning it requires a big investment. And so that's something that I think people should sort of like price in.
All right. We've been going for quite a while, so we should wrap up and I guess let you get back home to continue moving out of your house and back to America. It sounds like you have extremely broad knowledge of many different fields, or an impressively broad number of interests for a policymaker. Do you have any unusual philosophical views, or I guess on this show we're constantly talking about thought experiments and things like that. Do you have any views that would raise eyebrows maybe in the White House?
Let's see. Well, again, the White House is in many ways a rigorous place, but probably not the most philosophical place. So, I doubt that this stuff would come up that much. But yeah, so to give one, which is that I have over time really been swayed by sort of like arguments in favor of panpsychism. And panpsychism is basically the idea, I mean, I'm probably not going to describe it in its most sort of pristine and succinct philosophical summary, but the idea that consciousness exists along a spectrum and almost all things are maybe to some extent conscious. So perhaps a human is more conscious than a pig is more conscious than an ant. is more conscious than a tree. But then, if it really is continuous, then maybe a rock has like some infinitesimal level of... Exactly. And there is a great... this one's on my mind because I saw a friend for dinner the other day who had sent me this paper many years ago that was sort of the paper that first panpsychist pilled me, which I can share with you to put in the a link in the description. But it sort of lays out the case for thinking that you can imagine sort of organisms across a whole spectrum of distribution and complexity, where you have sort of what we think of now as like a single animal. You have something that's like an ant colony. You have these big emergent things like, for instance, the United States as an entity. Is the United States itself conscious? In many ways, it fulfills the criteria of things that we think of as being conscious, despite the fact, of course, that in day-to-day life, we don't really think about that way, even though we often describe it that way in the news, right? The United States wants to do X, has taken steps to accomplish Y. And so I sort of, it feels very counterintuitive to say that, inanimate objects have some level of consciousness, but I haven't found a better theory, so.
Yeah, is there a particular line of argument that particularly influences you? I guess people who are interested to learn more about this can go back and listen to the episode with David Chalmers on consciousness, where we spend a bunch of time on panpsychism because it's slightly having a renaissance.
I think
recently.
It is. I mean, essentially, it's almost a process of elimination thing where like I have not been swayed by arguments I've seen in favor of anything, in favor either of some specific determinant, so only carbon-based life forms can be conscious of something, or of a discrete cutoff where things transition suddenly from like being not at all conscious to being fully conscious. And intuitively, it seems reasonable. It seems natural to put things on a spectrum like this, right? Like, does an ant have the level of consciousness of a human? Most people probably say no. Does an ant have zero consciousness? I think most people would also say no. Or at least they would say that for a slightly larger animal, right? So, like a bird or something. And I think that once you allow that, it's difficult to get away from the idea that this exists along the spectrum. And then it's pretty easy to become swayed by the notion that if this exists along the spectrum, then like all kinds of other things, mass and electric charge and so on, perhaps you could imagine this being instantiated to some degree for almost everything, even if for many things it's so negligible as to be practically zero.
What do you think of LLMs? I guess, people with this view, it seems like should be more likely to think that there might be some level of awareness or some level of consciousness for something like GPT-4.
I'm certainly amenable to the idea that, I think we should assume that you can have non-carbon-based systems that are conscious until proven otherwise. Just intuitively, it seems to me as though
that feels like an easy one.
So starting with that as the premise, and then saying what do we think about existing LLMs? It's tough to say because at some level it does feel kind of like a rock. Right. Obviously, it's more sophisticated than a rock, but it does feel like something that, or all kinds of machines that we've made before that like accomplish specific tasks. And to some level, if you feel like you sort of understand how something works, there's an intuition that says, well, that takes out the magic that would explain consciousness in some way, right?
Some people, I've literally seen this argument made more or less that an LLM can't have goals or it can't be conscious because it's just a bunch of math. It's just a series of maths equations. But obviously, human beings are human beings are just a bunch of math, exactly. Or just a bunch of chemical interactions. So that doesn't work.
No, completely. So so I guess to go back to this premise, like it seems intuitive to think that all kinds of non-carbon-based systems could be conscious. When it comes to cashing it out in some kind of measure. And different people have tried things, right? There's like integrated information theory and like these various approaches. And I actually don't know how LLMs fare on like the IIT metric. But like, I think that we have sort of well-formed intuitions in some domains about where we'd put these things on the spectrum. Like if you polled a bunch of people and you gave them this spectrum of like 0 to 1 consciousness, and you gave them like humans and chimpanzees and lobsters and dogs, people would probably do it almost certainly in the same ordinal sequence. And I wouldn't be surprised if they landed sort of cardinally in the same regions. Whereas I think that our intuitions when it comes to anything that isn't carbon-based probably are much, much broader. Like, I wouldn't even really know where to begin. I appreciate this abstract argument that, like, well, if the information processing sort of infrastructure is the same, you can have these digital systems that are conscious. But, like, you know, would an LLM be closer to a rock or an ant? Or now there are different ways of measuring this, like how many neurons does it have? But then there are all these questions about, like, well, how much information is actually instantiated with the physical neuron versus like a neural nets neuron. So yeah, this is all a long way of saying, like, I really have no well-formed intuitions on this. Yeah.
I mean, I think saying that ChatGPT is conscious is an idiosyncratic position now, but I think it's not that crazy. I think many people at least worry that it might be to some extent.
Right.
And I feel like getting on board with that view is buying low in the hope that,
yes,
because I think in 10 years' time, the winds, like, I think we have a pretty good idea of which direction people's views are going to move on this.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. No, definitely, you could definitely, there's a good case for that as a sort of like speculative moral investment.
Yeah. Well, of course, we had the interview with Rob Long on consciousness.
Yeah, right, which I listened to the other day, which is very good.
I saw something on Twitter that I'm now not going to be able to find again, which was a survey of people asking them how conscious would they rank different things as being.
Interesting. Yeah, great.
Humans, various different animals, and I think rocks are on there as well.
Yeah.
I think that the surprising ones from memory were that people ranked dogs, I think, above babies.
Wow, really? That is
which
interesting.
I don't think is necessarily wrong, but I was surprised.
But it's surprising, like,
that.
emotionally, that people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people ranked trees above insects. Which,
really?
Also, I'm not sure is wrong, but I think I probably would go the other way.
Both of those surprised me.
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
But it was very clear that there was just a gradation. Like people mostly, by and large, do think that it's just a continuum.
Yeah. And then, you know, that seems intuitive, but it leads you all kinds of weird places. So I'm not married to any of those conclusions, but they seem difficult to avoid.
Well, hopefully one day we'll design an AI that can
can figure out the problem of consciousness. Exactly.
My guest today has been Teddy Collins. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Teddy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, so as I quickly mentioned in the intro, the Foundation Open Philanthropy is hiring for 16 different roles on their Global Catastrophic Risks team, which was previously known as the Long-Termism team until quite recently, I think. They're currently maybe the biggest non-government funder in the world for work that specifically addresses existential and near-existential risks from various different threats, especially ones that come from emerging technology. So if you love the kind of conversations that we have about those topics here on this show, then Open Philanthropy might be the kind of place that you would love to be as well. And I should repeat the COI disclaimer that I gave in the intro, that Open Philanthropy is 80,000 Hours' biggest donor, in part because we prioritize such similar problems and for pretty similar reasons. So those 16 roles are spread out across their various different focus areas, including AI governance and policy, AI technical safety, biosecurity and pandemic preparedness, building capacity to deal with global catastrophic risks, and prioritization across different and maybe new global catastrophic risks. Some of the roles are based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Others are in Washington, D.C., and I counted 4 that could be done remotely from anywhere, potentially. Applications for all those roles are expected to close on Thursday, November the 9th. So you've got a bit under a month. The role types are pretty wide-ranging, including program associate, senior program associate, security associate, operations associate, executive assistant, research associate, chief of staff, program operations, research fellow, and strategy fellow. The base salaries range from $83,000 a year for an executive assistant role to $190,000 for a lead researcher role, with most falling about in the middle of the range when I scanned over it. Folks who relocate to the San Francisco Bay Area do get a bit extra as a cost of living adjustment upwards because of the cost of living there. There's lots of details about all of the specific positions on the page on the Open Philanthropy website. So I won't attempt to go through them all, not even with GPT-4's help to summarize it. But given this was an episode primarily about AI governance, here's what Open Philanthropy's Senior Program Officer for AI Governance and Policy, Luke Mulhauser, had to say about the roles on his team. Open Philanthropy's AI governance and policy team aims to give away more than $100 million a year, and we're currently hiring for multiple grant-making roles. One role is a generalist role that could eventually specialize in many directions, funding work related to US, UK, or EU policy, or international coalition AI governance, or frontier AI lab policy, or building talent pipelines, or various other things. Another role requires a technical background in computer science or something similar, and would lead grant making on technical aspects of AI governance, such as compute governance, protecting AI models from hackers, technical standards development, model evaluations, and more. Those two roles can be based anywhere in the world, while there's a third role that must be based in DC and is focused on funding US AI policy advocacy work in DC, including lobbying to help the best policy ideas from think tanks and elsewhere get implemented by Congress or the executive branch. Okay, Rob again. If you want to learn more about those and all the other positions, which again are likely to close in under a month on the 9th of November, then head to openphilanthropy.org and click We're Hiring in the top right, then click through to multiple positions on our Global Catastrophic Risks team. If you're a great fit for one of them, then it could very easily be the way that you could have the biggest positive impact in your career, in my humble opinion anyway. I will say that OpenPhil is a pretty distinctive place to work, so it's worth looking into whether it's a good fit for you personally. As you might imagine, it's a fairly intense workplace where people really care about ideas and what they're working on, for example. And as you would expect, the typical person working there is a highly analytical thinker. You can listen to episodes with past guests of the show who work there, like Ajay Kotra or Tom Davidson or Alexander Berger, to help get a sense of whether it's right for you. That interview with Alexander Berger is from 2 years ago, so it's a little bit older, but Alexander is now actually the CEO of Open Philanthropy, so it could be a particularly useful one to listen to. If you'd like to discuss this or a similar career decision with someone on our team, you can apply, as always, for personalized one-on-one career advice from our advisors at 80,000hours.org/advising. And you can find all of those jobs and other similar ones and other different ones that might allow you to do a lot of good on our job board at 80,000hours.org/jobs. Of course, again, Open Philanthropy is our biggest donor, which I don't think is driving my view that it's a very promising place to work for people who want to have a big positive impact. But, common sense suggests that you shouldn't completely rely on any one source in forming a view. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris. The audio engineering team is led by Ben Cordell, with mastering and technical editing by Milo Maguire and Simon Monsour. Full transcripts and extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.